She found her father's dog still waiting. But her father was gone. Linda didn't believe in signs. But when she stepped into the senior home and saw the dog still, silent, watching an empty chair, she froze. Because that chair used to belong to her father. And that dog, that was Koa, the dog they said never made it back from the war. What unfolded from that moment wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning with memory, grief, and the kind of love that refuses to fade. Stay with us, because sometimes the ones who never leave are the ones who have the most to teach us. The sun hung low over San Diego that morning, its light softened by a gauze of marine haze, giving everything a pale silver hue. Outside Hope Haven Animal Shelter, the parking lot was beginning to fill families with excited children, volunteers with clipboards, and staff members bustling about in maroon shirts. It was a typical Saturday, full of motion and noise. But then he appeared. Walter Brennan, 75, stepped out of a faded green Buick that looked as tired as he did. He stood still for a moment, gripping the handle of his cane with one hand and the open door with the other. His body moved slowly, not just from age, but from a weight no doctor could measure. He wore a clean flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, suspenders clipped neatly, and a military-issued wristwatch still ticking on his weathered wrist. The cane tapped gently on the concrete as he made his way toward the entrance, each step deliberate. The automatic doors hissed open. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over linoleum floors, and the scent of bleach, fur, and hope intermingled in the air. Conversations buzzed around him. She's house-trained. Do you think he's good with kids? No, ma'am. That one's already adopted. But Walter heard none of it. He approached the front desk, where a young receptionist smiled. She couldn't have been more than 25. Good morning, sir. Looking to adopt? Walter gave a soft nod, adjusting his grip on the cane. I'm looking for a quiet companion, he said. His voice had the rasp of age and cigarettes long since quit. Not too young, not too wild, just someone who won't mind the quiet with me. The girl blinked, her smile softening. I think we can help with that. I'll let Ava know you're here. As she tapped on her tablet, Walter turned slightly, eyes scanning the posters on the wall. Adopt. Foster. Donate. Every animal deserves a second chance. One of the flyers had a photo of a gray-muzzled Labrador curled beside an elderly man in a wheelchair. Walter stared at it longer than he meant to. The image hit too close to home. A voice interrupted gently. Mr. Brennan. He turned to find Ava, a shelter coordinator in her late 30s, dark curls pulled into a loose bun, clipboard in hand. There was something grounded about her, like someone who had seen many endings, but still believed in beginnings. Right this way, she said kindly. We've got a few senior dogs that might be just what you're looking for. Walter nodded. That'd be fine. They walked side by side down the main corridor, past a wall of windows that looked into the first kennel row. The moment they stepped into the adoption wing, the sound hit him like a wave barking, whining, claws scraping metal gates, the occasional high-pitched yap or the thudding tail of a friendly retriever. Walter stopped, closed his eyes for a second. Something in him pulled taut. It was too loud, too alive. Ava must have noticed. It gets quieter past the larger dogs, she offered. We have a few shepherds, some labs. I'll show you the calm ones first. But Walter's eyes weren't on her anymore. They had caught something, a movement, a sound. He didn't know what. It was faint, not barking, not howling. A sound he hadn't heard in months, and yet it broke into his chest, like a key slipping into a familiar lock. A cry, soft, raw, almost human. He turned. Ava, he said, voice trembling. What's that sound? Ava paused, brows furrowed. She followed his gaze toward the farthest Routh corner kennel tucked away from the rest. I'm not sure. Might be one of the younger pups. That's where we've got the strays or surrenders still in evaluation. But Walter was already moving. His cane tapped a little faster. His breath caught. Something in that cry pulled him harder than logic. The barking faded behind him. As he neared the kennel, the sound grew clear, low, choked whimper that rose and fell like it belonged to someone grieving. Ava unlocked the latch to the small side gate and let him in. The corridor narrowed, lined with cages. He stopped in front of Kennel 23, and then he saw him. The deeper they moved into the shelter's back wing, the more chaotic the soundscape became. A symphony of need barking, panting, claws on tile, cage doors rattling with hope and desperation. Ava continued guiding Walter with practiced ease, her hand occasionally brushing a kennel latch to calm an overly eager pup. But Walter wasn't hearing most of it anymore. His ears strained for something quieter, something stranger, a sound that wasn't meant to be noticed, but somehow pierced through the noise like a note from a half-forgotten melody. It came again, a soft, hoarse whimper, low, like mourning, too layered to be instinct. It didn't ask. It remembered. Walter stopped walking. Ava noticed a beat later. "You all right, Mr. Brennan?" He didn't answer. His head had tilted slightly, as if listening to some distant voice only he could hear. "There," he said, pointing with the tip of his cane. "That sound. You hear it?" Ava paused, narrowing her eyes toward the far left corridor and auxiliary wing, not usually shown on first walkthroughs. "That's Kennel 23, I think," she murmured. "That one just came in recently. Young shepherd. Surrendered. No paperwork. We've barely evaluated him yet." Walter had already begun walking. His steps shaky but driven. The tapping of his cane sped up, one foot dragging slightly, the other stepping with more force than necessary. The further he went, the more the other dogs seemed to fade. It was as if the entire shelter held its breath. Then he turned the final corner and saw him, pressed against the back of his kennel, a young German shepherd, no more than 6 months old. His fur was the deep tan and sable of the classic line, but dulled at the edges as if life had taken some of his shine already. His ears hadn't quite finished growing into themselves. One was half flopped over like a flag in retreat. But it wasn't the fur, or the size, or even the age that stopped Walter in his tracks. It was the eyes. Those eyes knew him, not with curiosity, not with confusion, but with a shocked, trembling recognition, the kind of gaze that passes between two souls separated not by distance, but by circumstance. For one long second, neither man nor dog moved, and then the pup's body shifted suddenly, violently, as if something had snapped free inside him. He lunged forward, not with aggression, but with desperation. His front paws slammed against the chain-link fencing. He cried out, louder now, a high-pitched, broken sound that wasn't barking at all. It was closer to sobbing, a sound soaked in memory. "Koa?" Walter's voice cracked, raw and small in his own throat. The dog howled then, a short, aching note, followed by a frantic whimpering. His body shuddered. His tail beat the concrete like a frantic drum. His entire frame moved with a violence of emotion that stunned Ava into silence. The other dogs stirred, some barking louder at the commotion, but most just, quieted. "Koa," Walter repeated, almost like a prayer. His cane clattered to the floor as he dropped to his knee slowly, painfully. He pressed his hand against the metal fencing. "Is that really you, boy?" The pup shoved his nose through the lowest gap in the mesh, whining so hard he choked on it. He began pawing the Gatineau, scratching or demanding, but reaching. His paws kept missing the hand on the other side by inches. And then, as if his body couldn't hold all the feeling inside it, the tears came. Actual tears. They welled at the edges of the dog's eyes, glinting under the cold shelter light. One slipped down his muzzle, catching on the fur above his lip. He licked Walter's fingers through the fencing, not with excitement, but something gentler, as if he were trying to make sure this moment was real. Ava dropped her clipboard. "What? What is this?" she whispered. Walter didn't look at her. He couldn't. His hand shook as he moved it slightly to press his fingertips through the fencing, brushing against the damp muzzle that trembled against them. "This is Koa," he said hoarsely. "He was born in my garage. I bottle-fed him the first 2 weeks. I gave him to my wife while she was dying. He took a breath, deep but unstable. She used to say he was made of old soul, like he was too young to understand sadness, but still chose to carry it." Ava knelt down beside him, stunned. "He was surrendered 2 weeks ago. No microchip. They said they found him near Maple and 19th. Said he was a stray." Walter shook his head. "No, ma'am. This dog ain't never been a stray. He's been grieving, that's all." Koa had now sunk to the concrete, both front paws still through the gate, head resting between them, eyes locked on Walter's like he didn't dare blink. Ava slowly picked up her tablet, pulled up Kennel 23's profile. They said his name was Rusty. No. Walter's laugh was more like a breath. That ain't his name. Never was. He's Koa, named after the Hawaiian word for warrior. My wife chose it. Said he had fight in him, but not the kind that hurt, the kind that heals. And there it was, the silence. The kind that only happens in places where something sacred is unfolding. Walter looked up at Ava, his eyes glassy but focused. I need to see the paperwork. Something's not right. Ava nodded slowly, never taking her eyes off the pup. Yeah, she whispered. You're right. Something's very not right. She stood, her voice catching. Mr. Brennan, I think you should sit down. There's something we need to talk about. Walter didn't move. He stayed kneeling, fingers brushing Koa's muzzle, as if afraid that letting go might make this moment vanish like a dream. He didn't know it yet, but the hardest part hadn't come. Not the reunion, not the truth, but the choice. Koa didn't stop shaking, even as his body flattened against the gate, even as his tail thumped like a desperate heartbeat, even as the whimpers turned into low, tremulous moans that barely sounded like a dog at all. He kept trembling, as if every muscle in his growing frame was firing at once, unable to process what his eyes already knew. Walter pressed his palm to the chain link, and Koa pushed into it with the weight of his entire being. The steel rattled between them. Koa, Walter whispered again, his voice breaking around the name. He didn't say it like he was testing a theory. He said it the way a man says something he never thought he'd be allowed to say again. And at the sound, Koa erupted. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even a whine. It was a criss-o-raw, so guttural that one of the shelter techs walking by dropped the water bowl in her hands. The pup began pawing furiously at the gate, his claws scraping, his whole body trembling with such intensity it looked like he might collapse under the weight of his own emotion. His tail wagged so hard it threw off his balance, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every part of him was reaching for the man who had whispered his name like it was the key to his soul. Walter leaned in closer, his eyes flooded now. He slid both hands through the chain link, letting Koa press his nose between them, licking furiously, whining, then pulling back only to whimper again and paw frantically as if he feared this was some cruel dream. Ava stood behind them, frozen. So did two other volunteers who had wandered in at the sound. One of them, a teenage boy, had lifted his phone halfway then, slowly lowered it again, unable to film something so intimate, so private, so sacred. This doesn't make sense, Ava murmured. This doesn't make sense. But it did. It made perfect, heartbreaking sense. The pup hadn't just recognized Walter's scent. He had remembered his face, his voice, his presence, the core of who he was. He remembered the man who fed him warm formula at 2 a.m., who carried him outside wrapped in an old flannel shirt, who sat beside the hospice bed of a woman named Helen while the puppy lay at her feet, too young to understand death but old enough to sense love. Walter didn't speak for a long time. His throat refused to work. Instead, he rested his forehead gently against the cold metal of the kennel door. And in that quiet, Koa stilled, just for a moment. The pup sat, pressed his body as close to the door as he could, and slowly, like a child remembering the sound of a lullaby, he closed his eyes and exhaled. Walter raised his hand and placed it flat against the mesh again. You're okay now, boy, he whispered. I found you. A long silence followed, thick, tender, almost holy. Then Ava cleared her throat. Her voice was gentle, unsure. Mr. Brennan, she said softly, would you come with me for a minute? I think we should take a look at something together. Walter didn't look away from Koa. He's mine, he said, simple as breath. That's my boy. I believe you, Ava said. But I also need to show you what's on file. Something isn't adding up. With reluctance carved into every movement, Walter slowly rose. His knees cracked as he stood, and Koa whined again, clawing once more at the gate in protest. Walter reached through the bars, pressed 2 fingers to the pup's nose. I'm not leaving, he said. I'll be right back. Koa didn't bark, but the pup's eyes followed him with such intensity it was like a tethering, invisible line of trust stretching taut between them. Ava led him to the small staff room just behind the kennels, her tablet already open. She didn't speak until the door was shut behind them. "This is the intake record," she said, tapping the screen. "Dog brought in 14 days ago. Male German Shepherd. Estimated 5 to 6 months old. No microchip. Found alone near Maple and 19th. Walter frowned. "Maple and 19th is 3 blocks from my house." Ava looked up. "What?" "I used to walk Koa down there with my wife. There's a community garden and a little church with white columns. Koa always stopped to sniff the same flower bed, every time." A chill passed between them. "There's more," Ava said, turning the tablet toward him. "He was listed under the name Rusty. Person who surrendered him said they'd found him as a stray and tried to keep him, but he wasn't adjusting." Walter's hands clenched. "That's a lie." Ava nodded slowly. "I believe you, because that dog didn't react to me, or to any of our staff. For 2 weeks, he barely ate, wouldn't engage, refused to come forward when we approached. Some of us wondered if he'd been abused." Walter's voice was hoarse. "He wasn't abused. He was grieving." Ava sat down across from him. "So, what happened?" Walter stared at the floor for a moment, then spoke slowly, as if peeling back a wound that had only just started to scab. "I had a stroke a few weeks after my wife passed. Woke up in the hospital. My daughter, Linda, she said she found a family to take Koa while I recovered. I didn't know they'd given him up. She said he was doing great, that he was playing with their kids." His voice dropped. "She lied to me." Ava's hand hovered over the tablet. Then she shut it off, quietly. "I don't think we've had the whole story, Mr. Brennan," she said. "But I know one thing for sure." She glanced back toward the hallway, as if she could still hear Koa's cries echoing in her chest. "That dog doesn't want anyone else." Walter looked up. "Then help me bring him home." The fluorescent lights of Hope Haven hummed overhead, soft and sterile, unable to cut through the strange warmth that lingered near Kennel 23. Most Saturdays, the intake forms were simple paperwork to be filed, dogs to be assigned, another name on a clipboard. But today, that clipboard trembled faintly in Ava's hand as she walked toward the front office, her thoughts miles behind her, back with the old man and the trembling pup pressed against the gate. Walter stood by the exam table now, not sitting, just standing. As if sitting down might somehow suggest he could accept what was written on the form she'd just handed him. Stray. Male. 6 months. Found near Maple Street. That's what it said. But Walter's calloused hands had just cradled the pup's face like it was something sacred. He hadn't said much since whispering, "Koa?" But his eyes, those deep, war-worn eyeshads, said everything. Across from him, Dr. Alvarez quietly entered the small vet room. She didn't speak at first, only nodded to Ava and gave the dog a slow, observant once-over. Kawife, that was his name, was sitting on the floor now, body pressed against Walter's leg, like a shadow rediscovered. His tail moved only slightly, gently tapping the linoleum. He wasn't scared anymore. He was something else, anchored. Remembering, Alvarez knelt down, her latex-gloved fingers moving lightly along the pup's spine, past the shoulder blades, gently down to the hips. "He's healthy, mostly," she murmured. "Well fed. Clean ears, paw pads soft, but worn like he's walked a lot, but not on the streets." Her brow furrowed. Walter didn't look up. His hand stayed on Koa's back, just above the ridge where the fur darkened. "He wasn't a stray," Walter said quietly. Ava, still holding the intake sheet, bit her lip. It was an anonymous drop. No microchip. "We found him just off Maple." "Maple's where the clinic was," Walter said, his voice barely more than a memory, "where Evelyn went for her last checkups. We'd walk past the park there. Koa would always pull toward the kids. He loved the sound of them laughing." Alvarez paused, her hands still. She looked at Walter for a long moment, then turned back to the pup. "Let me try something," she said gently. She stepped back and called out softly, "Sit." Koa didn't move. His gaze never left Walter. She tried again. "Paw?" Nothing. Then Walter cleared his throat and bent slightly. "Koa," he whispered. "Front." Instantly, the pup rose and padded forward 2 steps, sitting squarely before Hymir's perked, eyes shining. Walter lifted a hand. Koa placed his paw on it. Dr. Alvarez inhaled sharply, then turned to Ava. "That's not a coincidence." Walter lowered himself slowly into the plastic chair, knees cracking audibly. I trained him, he said, his voice shaking. From 3 weeks old, bottle-fed. He wasn't even weaned when we brought him home. Evelyn said she wanted to leave something behind, something that wouldn't forget. Alvarez scribbled something into the margin of the intake form. Then someone lied, she said flatly. Dogs don't forget like that. Not this young, and not this deeply. Ava looked from the form to Koa and then to Walter, her throat tightening. But if there's no chip? Walter opened the breast pocket of his jacket, slowly pulling out a folded Polaroid faded at the edges, colors muted by time. In it, a younger Walter knelt beside a woman in a hospital bed, holding a German Shepherd pup the size of a loaf of bread. The woman's eyes were sunken but luminous. Her hand rested on the pup's back, as if steadying her own breath through the beating heart of the tiny dog. That's Evelyn, he said. And that's him. I named him after the island she always dreamed of visiting. Said it sounded like wind and memory. Ava took the photo with trembling hands. The pup in the image had the same light blaze between the eyes, the same ears that stood one moment and flopped the next. It was him. Alvarez looked at the form again. Either someone picked him up and dumped him, or someone wanted him hidden. The room fell silent. Only the low hum of the fridge and Koa's soft breath filled the air. Walter rubbed at his temple. After Evelyn passed, I lost myself. I gave him to a trainer. Thought he needed more than what I could give. Meant to get him back when I was ready. But they stopped answering. Alvarez glanced down at Koa, who had now settled on Walter's foot like it was home. She gently scratched the dog's neck. He's got signs of early trauma, she said softly. Mild hypervigilance, slight flinching on his left side, likely a result of a leash correction or worse. But whatever happened, your voice overrides it. Walter looked at her, eyes wet but steady. Because I never raised my hand to him. Not once. Ava looked down at the form one more time, then slowly crumpled the corner between her fingers. What do we do? She asked, almost to herself. Alvarez didn't hesitate. We do what's right, she said. And we start by changing that file. Koa lifted his head then, ears twitching slightly at the shift in energy. As if he understood. As if he knew he'd just been truly seen for the first time in a long while. Walter leaned forward and whispered again, almost reverently. You found your way back to me, didn't you, boy? The only reply was the gentle press of a paw on his knee and a single tear falling from the corner of the pup's golden eye. The consultation room was quiet, insulated from the barking kennels and the scraping of claws beyond the door. A faded poster about heartworm prevention hung askew on the pale yellow wall. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, but none of it reached Walter. He sat on the cushioned bench in the corner, hunched slightly from the weight of years and something heavier memory. In his arms was the pup, now calm, chest rising in the slow rhythm of safety. Walter's hand rested atop the dog's ribs, thumb gently stroking the fur that still held the scent of kennel straw. Koa, he murmured again. Not as a question this time, but like the word was a tether pulling both of them out of some long, dark water. Doctor. Alvarez sat across from them, clipboard forgotten on her lap. She didn't interrupt, not yet. She'd seen enough in the last 10 minutes to know this wasn't a routine intake mistake. There was something in the way the dog responded to the man's voice, not startled, not unsure, but as if it had found its way back to the beginning. Walter inhaled, the kind of breath that sounded like it had to pass through something tight in his chest before making it out. He was born on my porch, he said quietly, eyes not leaving Koa's face. Just a sliver of life. Couldn't open his eyes, couldn't cry right. Koa shifted, a small sound in his throat. His head nudged under Walter's hand as if encouraging the story to continue. I didn't think we'd keep him. Helen was already deep in it by then. Stage 4. Doctors gave her 6 months, but her smile didn't get the memo, she said. If we were going to count days, we'd better fill them with something that made the counting worth it. He stopped, blinked once. His voice was steady, but his hand had started to tremble. She'd always loved shepherds, said they looked like they carried ancient stories in their eyes. Alvarez's gaze softened. She knew that look, the one people wore when they weren't just telling a story, but trying to pull a ghost out of themselves. So we kept the runt, bottle-fed him with trembling hands and blueberry yogurt breath in the air. Named him Koa, Hawaiian for warrior. But he was never fierce, not once. Koa turned, pressing his side tighter into Walter's chest. You wouldn't believe how gentle he was. Even when he teethed, he'd mouth your fingers like they were glass. Walter's lips curved, barely. Helen called him our living hush, said the pain got quiet when he was near. The room was still. The kind of still that felt intentional. Outside the door, a dog yelped. But here, only the rhythm of breath and memory remained. Walter adjusted the way Koa lay across his knees, like he was settling an old friend into the softest spot. He'd curl up at the foot of her hospice bed every night. Never barked, never whined, just watched her. As if, his voice caught, as if he could measure the pain and take some of it. Like an hourglass running in reverse. Alvarez stood and walked slowly to the sink. Not to interrupt, but to give the man something that resembled dignity in the face of such tenderness. She rinsed her hands, not because they needed washing, but because moments like these deserved pause. She passed on a Sunday, Walter said softly. Light coming in through the curtain. She had one hand in mine, the other in his fur. Koa let out a breath, long and deep. Walter felt it against his ribs, almost like he remembered it too. And then, Walter whispered, I lost him, the night after the funeral. My neighbor left the gate unlatched. I thought he ran, thought maybe he'd finished what he came to do. Alvarez turned, eyes narrowing, heart slowly connecting the dots. Until today, Walter finished, one hand now on Koa's heart. Until that cry. The silence that followed wasn't hollow, it was full, brimming with everything unspoken between man and dog, between grief and grace. Alvarez walked over, crouched beside them. She gently reached to examine Koa's leg, noted the faint scar beneath the fur. Then she spoke, low and measured. He remembers her, she said. That kind of stillness, that doesn't come from training. It comes from proximity to love. Walter nodded, throat thick. Alvarez hesitated, then pulled the shelter file closer. But he was logged as a stray. Maple Street, no chip, no tags. Walter frowned. He was chipped. I did it myself at the vet before Helen passed. Ugh. They looked at each other, the implication obvious. Someone had removed it. Koa shifted, lifting his head slightly. His eyes weren't just brown, they were flecked with something brighter. Almost gold. The kind of gaze that memorizes you, then forgives you for leaving. Alvarez reached out, resting a hand on Koa's side. He's young, but there's an old soul in there, she whispered. And a story someone tried to erase. Walter's jaw tightened. But stories like his don't stay buried. Koa whined softly, then reached up with one paw and pressed it against Walter's chest, right above his heart. It wasn't a trick or a learned command. It was instinct, recognition, bond. A lifetime packed into 6 short months, and now, maybe, the beginning of something more. The rain had let up by afternoon, but the sky still wore its grief like an old coat, heavy, low, unwilling to lift. Inside the quiet consultation room of the shelter, Walter sat on the vinyl bench like a man clinging to a raft in the middle of an ocean he no longer understood. Koa lay curled against his side, his large frame pressing into the man's ribs as if afraid that the space between them would open up again. Ava had stepped out, sensing something sacred. Dr. Alvarez remained, standing near the door with quiet eyes, his clipboard forgotten at his side. Walter's hand moved slowly through Koa's fur. The rhythm wasn't just comfort, it was memory, each stroke a whisper from another life. I didn't get to say goodbye, Walter said softly, his voice caught somewhere between air and ache. That's the part that keeps me up. Dr. Alvarez didn't speak. Silence, he knew, was often kinder than answers. I had the stroke 6 months ago. It was sudden. One minute I was tying my shoes, and the next I was on the floor, tasting blood in my mouth. Walter gave a hollow chuckle. They tell you to watch for signs, but I didn't feel anything. Just Koa, barking like his chest was splitting open. He looked down at the shepherd now, his fingers trembling just above the collarbone. He wouldn't let the paramedics near me at first. Stood over me like a soldier, like he thought it was his fault I fell. Koa gave a soft whine, as if some echo of that day still pulsed in his bones. I was in the hospital for weeks, Walter went on, eyes glassed over. Then rehab. I begged them to let Koa stay with me, even just to visit. But my daughter, he trailed off, jaw tightening. Linda's a good woman, always means well. but she doesn't understand what this dog means. The word dog felt too small in his mouth. Walter exhaled, the sound brittle. While I was sedated, she took him, said it was too much for her to manage. Told me later that she found a nice family. Backyard, kids, laughter. Koa's ears twitched. He shifted closer, resting his muzzle on Walter's knee. I wanted to be grateful. I tried. Thought maybe he'd be happy. Walter's voice cracked, raw around the edges. But when I got home, the silence was unbearable. No click of paws on the kitchen tile. No head pressing into my hand while I watched television. He blinked, eyes distant. I called the family a week later. They didn't answer. Then Linda told me they'd brought him back here. Dr. Alvarez frowned gently. Why? Walter gave a long pause, the kind that opens something deeper than pain. She said, his throat worked. They said he was too still, wouldn't play, wouldn't eat much, just sat by the door and waited, day after day. The vet's lips pressed into a line. They said he didn't bark, didn't wag, just stared, like he was listening for someone who never came. The room felt colder suddenly. They brought him back like a used toy, Walter whispered. No note, no name, just dropped off at intake. Said he was a stray they found on Maple. Koa made a soft, guttural sound, not a whimper, not a growl. Just a sound like something had shifted inside him. Walter reached for him, and the dog leaned into the man's chest, pressing his body tight like he was trying to fuse into his ribs. Dr. Alvarez finally spoke, his voice careful. The file said he was found wandering. No chip, no tag. But when I examined him that first day, he didn't look like a dog who'd been lost. Looked like one who'd been left. Walter nodded once, eyes shining, but unshed. He waited. I know he did. There was something unbearable in that, knowing the image of Koa. Day after day, tail curled to his side, eyes glued to a door that never opened. Hope dimming, but never dying. Not entirely. Linda thought she was protecting me, Walter said, voice low. Didn't want me to grieve again, said I needed rest routine. He gave a sad laugh. But no one ever asks what kind of rest you get in a house that's missing its heartbeat. Koa nuzzled under Walter's arm, as if trying to take away the weight with the warmth of his body. Dr. Alvarez watched, quiet. But behind his steady gaze was a fury, aimed at systems that failed to see how animals are not interchangeable, how bonds are not replaceable. This wasn't just a man and a dog. This was two halves, torn apart by misunderstanding and stitched back together by something unspoken. He stayed by my wife's side until the end, Walter murmured. Didn't leave her bed once during her last 2 days. Wouldn't even eat. Just lay there breathing with her, like he was giving her permission to go. His fingers stopped moving. He was never the same after she passed. Neither was I. The rain began again outside, light as mist. The room held still, as if even time had chosen to sit and listen. Finally, Walter looked up at the vet. I need to take him home. Dr. Alvarez didn't hesitate. I'll start the paperwork. But before he stepped out, he paused at the door. He still remembers. That kind of bond doesn't vanish. It waits. Walter gave a soft nod. So did I. Koa let out a small sigh, his eyes closing. His body finally still, but this time, not in despair. This stillness was peace. The fluorescent lights in the shelter-side office cast a sterile hush over the room, a quiet that felt misplaced after the storm of emotions in Kennel 23. Walter sat in the dented aluminum chair, his hands resting on the old leash Ava had just handed him. It smelled faintly of cedar and milkweed, like afternoons long gone. His thumb ran slowly over the frayed leather, again and again, like a man reading Braille from a past life. Across from him, Dr. Alvarez leaned on the edge of the desk, arms crossed. Ava stood beside her, still holding Koa's intake file, fingers tense on its edges. Mr. Whitaker, the vet began gently, we're all moved by what we saw. I don't think anyone here believes that dog is a stranger to you. Walter looked up, eyes hollow but holding. He's not. He's family. Ava glanced at Dr. Alvarez, then back at the old man. We believe you, but we also have to talk about next steps. Walter nodded slowly, like a man preparing for bad news he already suspected. Taking Koa home, Dr. Alvarez said, choosing her words with care, means committing to raising a working-line German Shepherd. He's only 6 months old. He has the energy of 3 dogs and the instincts of a soldier. He was bottle-fed, Walter replied quietly, not as a protest but as a memory. He never learned to bark for fun. Only barked once to wake me when Helen had trouble breathing. Oh, they let that sentence settle. But raising him now, it won't be like before, Ava said. You've had a stroke. Your balance is recovering, but… I know, Walter interrupted. His voice didn't rise. It never did. I fall sometimes. My hand shakes when I butter toast. Koa, curled on the floor beside his feet, lifted his head slightly at the shift in tone. His ears perked at the stillness that followed. Ava crouched down and placed a hand on the dog's back. We just want to make sure you're safe, and that Koa has what he needs. Shepherds, they need more than love. They need movement, purpose. Walter looked at Koa. The young pup was still lean, ribs barely hidden beneath his sable coat, but the tremble had faded. His body pressed gently against Walter's boots, like he belonged there, like no time had passed at all. I don't move the way I used to, Walter admitted. I can't chase a tennis ball through the park. He paused, but I still remember how to sit in the sun on the porch. I remember how to speak to him soft when the world is loud, and I know how to stay. The room stilled. Ava stood slowly. It's not a matter of worthiness, Mr. Whitaker. It's logistics. If you fall again or end up hospitalized, who will take care of him? My daughter, he said bitterly, then caught himself. Number, not Linda. He sighed. That deep, empty sigh of a man who's rehearsed this in silence. I've got no one else. Not really. Dr. Alvarez walked to the window and looked out toward the kennels. Would you be willing to work with a placement volunteer? Someone who could check in regularly? Help if things change? Walter didn't answer immediately. His fingers were laced through Koa's collar now. The dog had inched closer without sound. The warmth of him grounded Walter more than any walker ever had. I'd agree to anything that brings him home, he said at last. The vet nodded but didn't move. It's not just about what brings him home. It's what keeps him there. Walter didn't flinch at that. Instead, he looked down at Koa again. You know, he said softly, like confessing to a priest who happened to have 4 paws. After Helen passed, there were days I sat on that porch and watched the road, hoping maybe someone would pull up and tell me this was all some mistake. His voice cracked, the first real break in his composure. But the only mistake was letting them take you. Koa shifted, head now resting on Walter's shoe. A single, quiet sigh escaped him, not whimper, not growl, just something tired and small and alive. Ava blinked fast, her voice suddenly softer. I'll talk to the director. We have programs, foster to adopt, long-term assisted placement. If you're open to that. I don't want to foster, Walter whispered. I want to finish what we started. He was a promise I made to my wife. He deserves better than being shelved like a memory. Doctor. Alvarez turned back from the window. Her face was unreadable. Not clinical, just careful. You might need help walking him. Then I'll learn to walk again. You'll need a vet who knows shepherds. He needs someone who knows him. Another silence. And then Ava, who'd been holding the intake file this whole time, finally set it down on the desk with a quiet, resigned thud. Her thumb rested on the name typed on the corner. Unnamed male. Approx. 6 months. Yuan from. He's not unnamed, Walter said, almost to himself. He's Koa. Koa stirred, as if in response, ears twitching. And for a moment, the room breathed differently, not like a shelter, but like a home in the making. Ava looked at Dr. Alvarez. The vet met her gaze, then turned back to Walter with something that resembled permission, but wasn't quite there yet. Let's take it one step at a time, she said. No promises. Just today. Walter nodded. Sometimes, today's enough. And on the floor, Koa exhaled once more, closing his eyes the first true sleep he'd allowed himself in weeks. Because sometimes, today is home. The metal bench creaked faintly as Walter sat down again, his breath catching in the hollow of his chest. The air inside the consultation room was cool, sterile, but he didn't feel the chill. Not with the warm, trembling body of the pup pressed tight into his side. Koa, if that was still his name, hadn't stopped touching him since the moment their eyes locked in Kennel 23. Now, The young shepherd leaned harder into Walter's ribs. His head nestled into the curve of the man's chest, one ear flicking at every small sound in the shelter. He wasn't just sitting beside Walter. He was draped across him like a memory that refused to let go. Dr. Alvarez stood quietly a few feet away, clipboard in hand, her eyes not on the papers but on the pair in front of her. She'd seen a lot in her years, reunions, surrenders, beginnings and ends. But this was something else. Not just a reunion, not quite relief. More like the return of something that neither the man nor the dog had realized was missing until it came back. "He hasn't wagged his tail since he arrived," she said gently. "Not once, not even for food." Walter looked down, brushing his fingertips through the soft ruff of Koa's neck. "He was never much for fanfare," he murmured, voice a bit hoarse. "But Helen used to say he always saved his tail wags for the people he loved." At the sound of her name, the pup's ears perked slightly, then laid back down, almost like a sigh. Dr. Alvarez approached slowly and crouched beside them. "I ran some quick cortisol scans earlier this morning. We've been tracking him because, well, his levels were higher than normal. Chronic stress, possibly grief. But right now," she held up the tablet and turned it toward Walter, "they're the lowest we've ever seen. Dropped significantly the moment you arrived. He didn't just recognize you. His body calmed down." Walter blinked, the data meaningless to him, yet the weight of her words unmistakable. "And yet, they still hesitate to let me take him home," he said quietly, without bitterness, only weariness. Koa shifted, paw pressing over Walter's thigh like an answer. Dr. Alvarez smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're 78, Mr. Langford. You've had a stroke. You walk with a cane and live alone. We have protocols, you understand. We're supposed to assess risk, future needs, long-term care." "I know," Walter replied softly. "But you're not measuring the other side of the story." She tilted her head, listening. "This boy," Walter continued, running a knotted finger along Koa's spine, "was born into my palms. I fed him from a dropper while my wife cried herself to sleep in the next room, knowing her cancer was winning. He was her last gift, my last promise." Koa made a soft, almost human sound, a whimper, a sigh, a remembering. "When she passed, he slept on her slippers for a week," Walter said. "Didn't eat, didn't bark, just waited." His voice cracked slightly. "We were broken together, and then we got better, together." Dr. Alvarez set the clipboard down. "What happened?" Walter exhaled, slow. "I had a stroke. Couldn't talk, couldn't walk. My daughter came from Oregon and said I needed care. She found a family for Koa. A good one, she said. With kids, a yard. But he came back. They said he was too still," Dr. Alvarez murmured, remembering the file. Walter nodded. "He's never been loud. But he was never still like that. Stillness, for him, means he's waiting for someone." Koa shifted again, this time resting his head on Walter's chest. Walter placed his hand over the pup's temple and closed his eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional bark from the kennels, the soft click of claws on linoleum in the distance, all of it melted into something tender and sacred. "This isn't about protocol," Walter whispered, eyes still closed. "This is about finishing what we started." Dr. Alvarez looked at the way Koa breathed in sync with the old man, how his tail twitched faintly when Walter spoke, how the tremble that had gripped him in the kennels was completely gone now, as if Walter's presence reset something primal. "He didn't just survive," she said. "He waited." Walter opened his eyes. "And so did I." She stood and walked to the door. Her hand paused on the frame. "There's a process. Paperwork. Home checks. Follow-ups. I understand. But," she looked back, her voice softer, "some stories don't fit on forms. Some homes don't have fences, but they have memory." Koa lifted his head, looking between her and Walter. "I'll talk to the board," she said, "and I'll recommend you both be allowed to go home, together." Walter didn't smile, not exactly, but something in his eyes, something quiet, maybe even sacred, flickered like the last candle in a vigil that had almost gone out. He leaned forward, touched his forehead to Koa's. The dog let out a soft breath. They didn't need applause. They didn't need music or words or signatures to mark the moment. Only the silence between them, and the weight of a head resting gently over a heart that never stopped waiting. The exam room was still filled with the low hum of a ceiling vent and the faint scent of antiseptic. Outside the glass, the shelter buzzed with distant barking, the rhythm of feeding schedules, and the measured footfalls of staff in scrubs. But inside, time slowed. Walter sat hunched on the vinyl-covered bench, one hand resting lightly on Koa's shoulder. The pup had curled against him like he had so many nights in the past, before the silence, before the absence. His chest rose and fell in sync with Walter's their breathing, one rhythm, one quiet conversation no one else could hear. Across the room, Dr. Alvarez leaned against the counter, arms folded, a clipboard tucked beneath his elbow. He wasn't writing, just watching. "This dog," he said finally, his voice low, almost reverent, "responds to you like no one I've seen." Walter offered a half smile, the kind that tried to lift but never quite made it past the weight behind his eyes. "He remembers. He more than remembers." Dr. Alvarez walked closer, pulling up a stool. "When Koa first came in, he didn't eat, didn't play, didn't react to other dogs. We thought maybe he'd been shut down too long to come back out of it." He looked at the pup, now nudging Walter's hand with the softest flick of his nose. But today, cortisol levels dropped. Tail wagged. Pupil dilation evened out when you touched him. Walter chuckled softly, the sound more air than voice. "Guess I still got the magic touch." "No," Alvarez said gently. "What you've got is history. Familiarity, safety." Koa shifted, resting his chin across Walter's thigh like it was a pillow worn by habit, his eyes half-lidded with a contentment no medication had managed to deliver in months. "And that's where we come to a difficult crossroad," Alvarez added, voice softening. "We have protocols, Walter. Evaluations, age restrictions, housing conditions. You know the drill." Walter nodded. "Too old, too broke, too many risks." The room held a long pause. "I didn't say that," Alvarez said. "I said there are protocols, but sometimes medicine isn't always just about following charts." He tapped the edge of the clipboard thoughtfully. "I want to propose something. A different kind of treatment." Walter looked up. Alvarez smiled faintly. "A prescription. For you." Walter's brows lifted. "You prescribing me a dog now, Doc?" "Not just a dog," Alvarez corrected. "This dog, Koa. As part of your post-stroke cognitive and emotional rehabilitation." Walter blinked. "You're serious?" "Completely. Koa let out a low, peaceful sigh, more felt than heard, and Walter instinctively placed a hand on the pup's back, thumb moving in slow circles along the fur. It was an old motion, muscle memory, from a life before IVs, before hospital gowns, before absence. Alvarez leaned forward. "I've seen studies on animal-assisted therapy. But more than that, I've seen people. I've seen what touch, routine, even silent companionship can do. The VA might not recognize it yet, but I do. I do." Walter let the words settle. He looked down at Koa, who now had both front paws slung gently across his lap like a child clinging to a parent. The boy was only 6 months old, barely more than a puppet, carried a grief that mirrored Walter's own. They had both been left behind in different ways. "My daughter," Walter began, but stopped. His throat tightened. Alvarez waited. "She thought it was best," Walter managed, voice thick. "After Helen passed, after my stroke, said I couldn't take care of him, that he needed more than I could give." "And what do you think?" Alvarez asked. Not as a doctor, but as a man. Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at Koa, into that face that had waited by Helen's hospice bed, who'd watched the light in her eyes dim day by day, but never moved, never left. "I think," Walter said finally, "he's the only thing I have left that still remembers her smell." There was a long quiet. Alvarez reached for his clipboard. "We can make this work. Under special consideration, you'll come in once a week for checkups. We'll monitor both of you heart rate, sleep, behavior. I'll call it a therapeutic trial, if anyone asks." Walter blinked at him. "You're willing to do all that?" "I'm willing," Alvarez said, scribbling something down, "because you're the first patient I've seen who laughed in 3 months just because a dog nudged your knee." Walter looked away quickly, the corners of his eyes wetting. The VA never gave me anything that worked this well, he whispered. Then let's call it what it is, Alvarez said. Medicine. Koa stirred, nudging closer. And besides, the doctor added, standing to file the paperwork, he's already chosen you. We'd be fools to argue with that. Walter chuckled through a wavering breath. You sure this isn't just my heart getting ahead of my head? I think your heart's known the truth longer than the rest of you. A light knock came at the door. Ava poked her head in, holding a manila folder. I pulled the intake records again, she said quietly. There's something odd about the timing, the address. We might have found the wrong family. Alvarez nodded, signaling to hold it for later. He looked back at Walter. For now, let's focus on the real family. Walter's hand rested on Koa's back. His voice came low, steady. With that softness men like him rarely let out in public. Come on, boy, he whispered. We're going home. And this time, Koa wagged his tail knot out of reflex. Not from command, but from knowing. From finally, unmistakably being seen. The hum of the office heater was the only sound for a long while, broken now and then by the soft shuffle of paper or the rustle of a chair adjusting under tension. Miranda Chen sat at the head of the long shelter conference table, reading the proposal for the third time. She wasn't stalling, she was absorbing. Every sentence, every clause had weight, but it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made her pause the longest. He doesn't need a home. He already found one. All we're doing is catching up. Dr. A. Outside the glass window, Koa was lying on his side in the kennel run, pressed up against the chain link as close as he could get to the direction of the office. His tail was still, his body calm. He didn't whine, didn't bark, just waited. And Walter? The old man sat a few feet away. In the folding chair one of the volunteers had fetched earlier. Hands clasped over his cane. Eyes, closed, not sleeping, just being. Like he didn't want to disturb whatever fragile thread still tied them together. Miranda sighed, setting the papers down. Across from her, Janet from intake fidgeted with a capped pen. She was one of the newer staff, sharp, principled, organized to a fault, and deeply uncomfortable. I don't want to sound heartless, Janet began, but this is a 6-month-old German Shepherd, not a goldfish. These dogs need space, exercise, a consistent handler, someone who can keep up. Miranda nodded slowly. I hear you. And Walter, Janet hesitated. He's 78. He had a stroke 4 months ago. He uses a cane. What happens when Koa grows into a 90-pound ball of energy and nobody can walk him? Silence settled again, thick and familiar in this room where hard calls were made. Miranda turned toward the medical file Dr. Alvarez had submitted, flipping it open. A cortisol chart, annotated logs of Koa's behavior over the last 10 days. Notes written in clipped handwriting, firm and steady. Day 2. No tail wagging. Flinches from male voices. Day 4. Won't eat unless Walter visits. Day 6. Heart rate stabilizes when Walter enters. Day 7. First tail wag recorded only when Walter spoke his name. Look, Miranda said softly. We don't know why he ended up listed as a stray. But this isn't just some fluke bond. That dog knows Walter, and Walter knows him, even if his daughter won't admit it. Janet crossed her arms. But that's the thing. His daughter didn't tell us. She returned him under a lie. What does that say about the support system Walter really has? What happens if things get worse? Miranda didn't answer right away. She rubbed the corner of her eye, where a long day was making itself known. The past few weeks had drained them all between intake overflow, budget approvals, and now this unlikely reunion. But something about Koa and Walter tugged at her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. That quiet connection, the kind you don't manufacture, the kind you don't find, unless life's been cracked open enough to let light fall between the fractures. I'm not suggesting we throw protocol out the window, Miranda said finally. But maybe we use the tools we do have. A creative foster arrangement, medical oversight, staff visits, weekly behavior check-ins. Janet arched an eyebrow. You mean a 90-day trial? Foster to adopt with supervision, Miranda clarified. Koa stays microchipped to the shelter for the duration. We assign a case manager, preferably someone Koa already trusts. I'll even put in a rotation of volunteers to help with walks and vet visits. Janet looked unconvinced. He'll still need training, she countered. Then we schedule bi-weekly sessions here, Miranda said, almost gently. We use this moment to build something instead of just worrying it'll break. Janet stared at the table, her fingers tapping lightly against the wood. Then, reluctantly, she sighed. I've just seen too many good intentions fall apart. Miranda softened. Me too. There was a knock on the glass. Dr. Alvarez stood outside, a soft smile on her face. She held up a laminated printout Walter's blood pressure chart from his last visit to the VA clinic, and beneath it, a scribbled note. BP lower than average baseline after 30 mins with COA. Janet's expression shifted slightly, her walls cracking just a little. You're really going to let a dog write a prescription now? Miranda chuckled. Not just a dog. This dog. Janet didn't smile, but she didn't object either. That, from her, was as good as a yes. Later that evening, after the plan was finalized and the forms were printed, Miranda walked out to the kennel area herself. Walter was still there, coat pulled over his lap, eyes trained on the fencing like he could see the horizon through it. COA stirred the moment she approached, lifting his head, ears up. Mr. Barnes, she said, crouching beside him. We have a proposal. Walter turned, slow and measured. His eyes were red-rimmed, but clear. Don't make it sound like a verdict, he murmured, voice low. She smiled. We'd like to offer you a foster agreement. 90 days. Supervised, supported, and completely optional. But you and COA, you'd get to try this. Together. Walter didn't answer right away. He just looked down at COA, who was now pressing his head into Walter's thigh, eyes half-lidded like he already knew. I don't know what kind of miracles you believe in, Miss Chen, he whispered, but this one found me. I'd be a fool to send it away again. Miranda stood, quietly placing the papers into his hand. Then let's not waste another day. The pen trembled slightly in Walter's hand. It wasn't age that made it shake. Not really. It was the gravity of the moment, the finality, the kind of weight a man doesn't often get to feel in an old body. Not this late in the story. Across the table, Miranda laid out the papers one by one, her voice soft and deliberate, as if not to startle anything sacred in the air. Initial here and here. This one confirms the 90-day medical foster agreement. COA will remain under observation, but the care, the love, that's all yours. Walter nodded, slowly, thoughtfully, as though each signature meant more than just ink on paper. It meant time. It meant responsibility. It meant a second chance for both of them. His eyes, cloudy with age but still sharp in their own quiet way, lifted toward the dog curled at his feet. COA had not moved since they entered the room. Not even when the shelter door opened, not when new voices arrived, not even when a volunteer dropped a clipboard. But when Walter shifted in his chair, COA raised his head, rested it on Walter's knee like a seal on a covenant. No sound, no bark, no plea, just presence. Steady, undemanding, as if to say, wherever you go, I go. Miranda hesitated, then reached across the table and gently offered the final sheet. Last one, she said. Walter took a breath. The kind you take before saying goodbye, or hello. And then, in letters a bit jagged but unmistakably his own, he signed, Walter Emery. A pause followed, small, but full of everything unspoken. And in that pause, COA moved. He rose, leaned against Walter's side with a kind of certainty that felt ancient like the earth, remembering its own name. And then, just as the room held its breath, he wagged. Not a frantic wag. Not the kind that spins in circles or chases its own tail. Just one slow sweep of joy from left to right, as if dusting off the grief that had been clinging to the walls of that room for too long. A gasp broke the silence. It came from the intern, Natalie, who covered her mouth with both hands. Beside her, Dr. Alvarez blinked once, slowly, and gave a small, tired smile. Miranda's eyes glistened. The applause wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind you'd hear in a theater or after a hero returns from war. It was the kind of applause born from reverence, the way you'd quietly celebrate a flower blooming in the crack of a sidewalk. Small, soft, sacred. Walter looked down at COA. That's your answer, huh? He whispered. COA leaned in further, nose nudging Walter's hand. tail sweeping once more like a promise. Walter stood, slowly, his back curved with years, but his grip on the leash was steady. He didn't pull, he didn't command, he just opened the door. Koa followed, and that was that. Outside, the sun had begun to drop behind the line of elms near the shelter parking lot, casting everything in amber. Walter squinted into the glow, his left hand absently reaching to block the light. Koa walked beside him, perfectly in step, as though he'd done so 1,000 times before. At the curb, someone had written in chalk, "Second chances happen here." The words were fading, dulled by rain and time. Walter stopped for a moment, reading it like scripture. He spoke without looking down. "You ever think maybe dogs don't remember the way we do, Koa? That maybe they just forgive?" Koa didn't answer, of course. But he leaned his weight into Walter's leg just enough to make the old man steady his stance. Walter chuckled, a small sound. "Yeah, I guess that's the same thing." Behind him, the shelter door creaked open. Miranda stepped halfway out and called gently, "Walter?" He turned. She didn't say much, just held up the folder. "I packed his vet file, food list, the calming spray he liked, and this." She handed him a faded photo. It was a printed shelter intake, picture grainy and harsh. Koa's eyes in it looked hollow, like someone had turned off the lights inside him. Walter took the photo and slipped it into his coat pocket without looking. He didn't need to. The dog at his side was already rewriting that picture. They started down the walk. One old man, one young dog, two souls. Neither where they expected to be, and yet somehow exactly where they belong. Walter said it softly, almost to himself. "We're going home, boy." Ambry. Koa let out a low chuff, not quite a bark, not quite a sigh, and walked a little closer, his shoulder brushing against Walter's hip, matching his gait step for step. And for the first time in a long time, there was no noise in Walter's chest. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache, the kind that heals. The sun had dipped low, casting long fingers of amber across the cracked parking lot. As Walter opened the truck's passenger side door, Koa hesitated for a heartbeat, then, without needing to be told, he jumped in, landing softly on the vinyl seat like he'd done it his whole life. Walter took a moment before circling around to the driver's side. His hand lingered on the doorframe. The truck, a dented Ford with paint worn thin from salt and sun, had carried so many memories. Grocery runs, church on Sundays, late-night drives to the emergency room. And Helen always Helen in the seat where Koa now sat, her scarf fluttering in the wind, humming old Patsy Cline tunes with the windows down. He climbed in. The driver's seat creaked beneath his weight, the familiar groan of age and wear. For a second, he didn't start the engine, just stared ahead, hands resting on the wheel. Koa looked up at him, no bark, no whine, just presence. The shelter faded behind them as the engine coughed to life and settled into a quiet hum. Gravel crunched under the tires as Walter guided the truck onto the main road, headlights flickering on like tired eyes adjusting to dusk. Koa pressed his shoulder gently into Walter's arm and rested his chin near the cup holder, eyes tracking the landscape slipping past the window. They passed the diner where Walter and Helen used to sit in the booth by the window him with black coffee. Her with tea and honey. Always honey. The windows now were dark. He wondered if the same waitress still worked the morning shift. "You know," Walter murmured, more to the quiet air than the dog, "she used to keep a little notebook. Wrote poems in the margins of crossword puzzles. Never let me read 'em all. Said some things needed to stay folded." Koa blinked slowly, his breath fogging the glass just faintly. The drive home was short, but every mile was layered with memory. The spot near Maple Hollow, where Helen once pulled over to cry, silently, because the doctor had said months, not years. The curve by Lakewood Pines, where Koa had his first walk on leash, awkward paws too big for his frame, bumbling like a toddler through the leaves. And Noe was back, not quite a puppy, not yet grown. And Walter, well, he wasn't the man he used to be either. He glanced sideways. Koa sat dull, watchful, but calm. The kind of calm that came not from training, but from trust. "You're not Helen," Walter whispered, "but the seat doesn't look so empty now." It wasn't a poetic line, but it was honest. The sky turned violet as they reached the old neighborhood, mostly retirees now, shutters drawn early, porch lights flickering on in sleepy sync. Walter eased the truck into the driveway, gravel hissing under the tires. The porch light had burned out 2 weeks ago. He made a mental note, knowing full well he'd forget. Koa didn't move until Walter opened his door and said softly, "Come on, boy." The dog stepped down and stood beside him, ears perked, tail still. The last time he'd stood in this yard, Helen had still been alive. The house still smelled like soup and lavender. There had been music, even on the quiet days. Now, the house held echoes. Walter opened the door, and they entered together. The air was cool, faintly stale. He hadn't cooked in days. Mail had piled up in the fruit bowl, but the living room was still as Helen had left either blanket folded over the armchair, her old slippers by the hearth. And the photo on the mantel, Helen holding a 6-week-old Koa who had fallen asleep in her lap like he already knew this was home. Koa patted in slowly. His nails tapped lightly against the floorboards. He sniffed the air, then the rug, then the corner where his old crate used to be. He didn't rush. He didn't bolt. He simply remembered. And Walter watched him, something catching in his throat. "I kept your toys," he said, clearing his voice. "Even the one you tore apart. She stitched it back together with blue thread. Wouldn't let me throw it out." Koa stopped near the fireplace. His head turned slightly, like he heard something only he could understand. Then, with the grace of something sacred, he walked over to the recliner and laid down at its foot just like he used to, as if the 6 months apart had folded into a breath. As if this had always been the plan. Walter sat across from him in the other chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His fingers trembled slightly, but not from weakness, from release. "You waited," he said, voice low. "I didn't know if you would. I didn't even know if I'd get the chance to ask." Koa lifted his head, ears turning. For a moment, there was only silence. No barking, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of the fridge. Just 2 old souls in an old house that hadn't heard laughter in a while. Walter exhaled. Not a sigh, something deeper. "You don't have to fix anything, boy," he whispered. "You just have to be here." Koa responded not with a sound, but with a slow, almost imperceptible tail thump against the rug. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Walter closed his eyes. "We'll be okay," he said again. This time, not just to himself, not just to the seat beside him, but to the empty room, the ghosts who lived in the corners, the love that had lingered through storms and sickness and silence, to the dog who had come home. The old truck's brakes let out a soft hiss as Walter eased it to a stop at the curb. He cut the engine, but didn't move. For a moment, silence filled the cab, broken only by the faint ticking of the cooling engine and the steady rhythm of Koa's breath beside him. The young German shepherd sat upright on the passenger seat, alert but calm. His ears twitched at every sound, the wind rustling through the dying oak leaves, the distant bark of a neighborhood dog, the whisper of Walter's old bones shifting. Walter exhaled slowly and reached for the door handle. "Well, boy," he murmured, voice gravelly, worn down by years and goodbyes. "Here we are." The screen door groaned when he opened it. It hadn't been oiled since Helen passed. He used to mean to fix things like that. But meaning to had become its own kind of silence, like the calendar still flipped to June. Like the coffee cup that stayed on the drying rack because he didn't see the point in putting it away. Koa hesitated on the porch. His nose lifted, twitching in soft, deliberate sways. Then he stepped in. The house had the scent of dust and lavender. Helen's favorite potpourri still lingered faintly from the shelf above the television. Koa patted cautiously, body low, tail held neutral, not tucked, not wagging, just waiting. He sniffed the corner of the rug where Walter's cane usually rested, then the hallway, then the base of the recliner. And then suddenly, like instinctor memory passed from some unspoken language of sorrow, Koa trotted to the living room and leapt up onto Helen's chair. Walter froze. That chair had been hers, through chemo, through the quiet, after church, through the nights when her hands trembled too much to hold a book, but she still liked the feel of it on her lap. Koa stood on the cushion, ears perked, eyes aimed toward the kitchen, toward the hallway, toward something. And then, slowly, as the house gave no answer, he lowered himself. First his haunches, then his front legs, then his chest. He curled into the softness, like he was waiting for someone who'd just stepped outside to return. Walter didn't speak. His hand rested on the back of the armchair, steadying himself. Not for balance, but for something deeper. For that ache in the ribs that wasn't about the heart or the lungs, but the kind of pain that had no medical name. "She won't be back," he said finally, voice almost breaking on the word back. "But I'm glad you waited." Koa didn't move. He just turned his head, and in those deep, knowing eyes so still, so solemn was the gentlest echo of understanding. Walter stood there longer than he meant to. His knees protested. His back stiffened. But he didn't care. Because somehow, in that silence, with the sun casting soft gold across the hardwood floor, something had shifted. It wasn't like the house felt full again. No, not that. But it no longer felt empty in the same way. Later, Walter placed a small blanket at the base of Helen's chair. Just something soft, just in case Koa wanted to curl up closer. But the dog refused to move. That night, Walter tried sleeping in his own bed, but the house felt too large, the quiet too heavy. So he returned to the living room, where the recliner sat still, its fabric warmed by fur and faith. Koa lifted his head when Walter shuffled in. He thumped his talons, just once. Walter sat in the chair across from Helen's. It creaked under his weight. He rubbed his knees. He stared at the blank television screen. "Never thought I'd bring another soul into this house," he said softly. But maybe she knew. Koa's eyes never left him. Not for a moment. Then came the smallest thing. A stretch, a sigh, and a tail that, this time, thumped twice. Walter chuckled under his breath. "You got good taste, boy," he whispered. "She'd have liked you." No fireworks, no dramatic music, just two souls relearning how to breathe under the same roof. And somewhere outside, a wind passed through the trees like a hush, like a hand brushing gently across old grief, saying, "It's okay to feel this again." The late afternoon sun bled gold across the living room floor, painting long shadows that reached up the faded wallpaper like fingers searching for something lost. Walter stood by the door, one hand still resting on the knob, though he hadn't opened it in minutes. His other hand was clenched at his side, not in anger, but in something quieter, a kind of ache that had no words. Across the room, Koa lay curled in the exact spot where Helen's recliner used to be, though the chair was gone, now given away after the funeral, when Walter couldn't bear to look at it. And yet, the dog had found the outline, the ghost of that space, and made it his own. His body was still but alert, ears flicking at every creak in the wood, as if expecting someone who should be there. Walter watched him with a pain he didn't try to hide. No one was around to see anyway. Koa had spent the first few hours exploring the house like a child, returning to a place half remembered from dreams. His nose traced the baseboards, the corners of kitchen cabinets, the door frames. When he reached the narrow hallway lined with picture frames, wedding photos, military medals, a faded watercolor Helen once painted of the garden, he had stopped. Not frozen in fear, but in a kind of recognition. And now, here he was, lying in Helen's place, as if she'd whispered it to him from somewhere between the floorboards and the wind. Walter swallowed hard, but it didn't help. In his mind, the past arrived not in a rush, but in fragments. A young Koa, barely bigger than a pillow, sitting with his chin on Helen's knee while she sat wrapped in her shawl, IV tube winding from her arm like a pale vine. Her eyes were tired, yes, but her smile wasn't. She had whispered to the pup as if the world would unravel if she raised her voice. "He's listening," she had told Walter once, stroking Koa's head with a gentleness that felt holy. "He knows when I'm hurting before I say a word." And she had been right. Koa had followed her to chemo appointments with a quiet that no one expected from a pup. The nurses gave him soft treats, and Helen knitted him a little red neckerchief with trembling hands during one particularly long session. Walter had kept it, folded in a drawer with her letters. In the garden, Helen would sit beneath the Japanese maple, fingers brushing the lavender, while Koa rested at her feet. When she couldn't walk far anymore, Walter built her a bench under the arbor. She would rest there, and Koa would sit pressed against her side, unmoving, unwavering. Walter remembered that afternoon clearly, the day Helen had leaned her head against the dogs and said, "You're going to stay, even when I go. That's your job, isn't it?" And Koa had thumped his tail once, like he understood. A soft whimper pulled Walter back to the present. Koa shifted in his spot, then looked up at Walter with those solemn eyes, the kind that seemed older than any 6-month-old pup had the right to carry. His ears flicked back slightly, not in fear, but in something else, almost empathy. Walter sank slowly to the floor, knees creaking, his back pressed against the door as he exhaled. The tears came quietly. They always did now. Not the kind that demanded noise or spectacle, but the ones that moved slowly, reverently, like rain over stones. He didn't wipe them away. Across the room, Koa didn't move. He just watched. Walter's voice came like gravel. "She'd have loved to see you again. God, she would have—" He trailed off. There was no one to finish the sentence, but the silence. The clock in the kitchen ticked in that hollow, echoing way old houses always seem to amplify. Outside, a bird called high and fleeting. Somewhere down the road, a truck passed, and its rumble faded into nothing. And in all of that stillness, something shifted. Koa stood. He padded across the room slowly, without hesitation, and laid his head against Walter's knee. Not demanding, not even asking, just there. Walter looked down at him, and for the first time in a long time, didn't feel entirely alone. He let one hand fall gently onto the dog's head, and Koa leaned into the touch, as if memorizing it. "This house is too quiet without her," Walter murmured. "More to the room than to anyone, but I suppose we can fill it with something else. Not noise, not anymore, just being." Koa blinked slowly. Then, with a deep exhale, he curled up beside Walter, not quite touching him, but close enough that the warmth reached. Later that evening, as the sky turned the color of ash and fire, Walter brewed 2 cups of tea out of habit. One he set down by the empty chair. The other he carried with both hands as he moved through the house, Koa shadowing him. In the hallway, he paused by the watercolor Helen had painted that tiny lavender patch under the Japanese maple. Faded now, but still hers, still home. He reached out and brushed a finger along the edge of the frame. "She painted this the week you arrived," he whispered to Koa. "Said the color of your eyes reminded her of dusk." The pup said nothing, of course, but he sat still and listening, like Helen used to when Walter read aloud before bed. A long silence fell between them. Not uncomfortable, just familiar. That night, Walter left the bedroom door open. Koa lay on the rug beside the bed, not making a sound. But in the early morning, when the wind creaked through the chimney and Walter stirred from a dream of sand and gunfire, he felt a weight against his calf. He didn't move. He just breathed, slow and deep, and Koa stayed there, as if he, too, had wandered through some echo of memory, only to find himself back where he was needed, with the man who had always loved the woman, who had always loved the dog. Morning came slowly, as it had each day since Helen passed gray light creeping in through the half-drawn curtains, dust motes dancing in the still air. The house didn't hum like it used to. No kettle boiling, no soft humming from the kitchen. Just the sound of the wind nudging the shutters and the occasional creak of the wood settling into silence. Walter sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring down at the floor where a pair of worn slippers waited. They weren't his, they were Helen's. He hadn't moved them. Maybe part of him never would. A low huff of breath drew his attention. Koa lay at the foot of the bed, his head resting on his outstretched paws, eyes watching Walter without judgment, without expectation. Just there, breathing, waiting, matching his stillness. Walter exhaled and managed a hoarse whisper. "Time to get up, old boy." Koa didn't leap. He didn't rush the door. He simply rose, stretched slowly first the front legs, then the back end followed Walter down the hallway like a shadow that had learned to walk. In the kitchen, the first ritual of their new life began. Walter poured kibble into the bowl, Helen's old ceramic one, the word "ko" still painted in her handwriting along the rim. Koa sat without being told, tail brushing softly against the floor. Walter filled his own mug with black coffee, hands trembling slightly as he lifted it. Across from him, the table sat set for 2, a habit he hadn't broken yet. He looked at the empty chair, then at Koa, who had finished eating and now lay curled at Helen's feet, or where her feet used to be. "She'd talk to you every morning," Walter murmured. "Read you the newspaper like you understood every word." Koa blinked slowly, his ears shifting as if he recognized the cadence. even if the meaning was lost. The walks were short at first, just down to the fence post where the sycamore tree stood, a tree Helen once called her living clock because of the way its leaves would change by the day. Koa kept pace with Walter, never pulling ahead, never lagging behind. When Walter paused, Koa paused. When Walter's breath caught, Koa looked up, as if to say, "We can stop here, if you need to." Some days they did. They stood in silence, looking out over the field where Helen used to pick wildflowers. Sometimes, Walter would feel his throat close, and Koa would press gently against his leg, anchoring him in the now. Healing wasn't loud. It didn't come in grand moments or cinematic revelations. It came in these soft footfalls on gravel, the rhythm of breath shared on a porch swing, the way Koa rested his chin on Walter's shoe when he sat too long at the window. Inside the house, they settled into their new patterns. Walter stopped turning the television on just for background noise. Instead, he started humming again tunes Helen used to hum while folding laundry or cooking dinner. Koa seemed to recognize them. At the sound, he'd lift his head, ears twitching, tail giving a slow wag. At night, Koa curled up beside Walter's recliner. Not Helen's, not yet. That one still held a sacred stillness. Neither of them were ready to disturb. But Walter's chair was now their shared space. When Walter reached down to rest his hand on Koa's back, it was met with warmth, not expectation. Presence, not pressure. Walter spoke more now, not always with people, but with Koa. "You always sat by her when she was sick," he said one afternoon, staring out the window. "Never barked, never moved, just laid there." Koa didn't reply. He didn't have to. "She said you could feel her pain, like you pulled some of it into yourself so she didn't have to carry it alone." Ugh. The words settled into the quiet, like leaves drifting to the earth. A week in, the house began to breathe again. Walter found himself opening windows, letting the light in. He cleared the old mail off the table, put away the winter coats. Not because he was moving on, but because he wasn't alone in the stillness anymore. There was a moment, small, ordinary, when Walter realized the healing had begun. He dropped a spoon in the kitchen. The clang startled him, as it always did, and the old tremor returned. The one from Afghanistan, the one that had never fully gone away. He sat down hard on the floor, breath shallow. But Koa came to him not frantically, not barking. He simply sat beside him, pressed his body gently against Walter's ribs, and waited. Walter reached for him. And this time, when his hand shook, it found steadiness in fur. That night, Walter wrote his first letter in months. Not to anyone he'd send it to. Just a page in Helen's old journal. "He hasn't barked once. Doesn't need to. He knows." God, Helen, you were right about him. He's not just a dog. He's a rhythm, a pulse. And somehow, he's helping mine find its beat again. Walter paused, then added, "It's not flashy, but it's real." He closed the notebook and looked down. Koa was already asleep, his breathing soft and even, just like Helen's had been. Before the pain got loud, Walter reached down and stroked his ear. "Thank you, boy," he whispered. Koa didn't stir. But for the first time in a long while, Walter didn't feel the ache of emptiness when silence answered back. The rhythm of Walter's days had changed, not in grand, sweeping strokes, but in the slow and tender way a wound begins to scab over a quiet shift that doesn't call attention to itself, but becomes life nonetheless. Every morning now began the same way. At 6:37 a.m., the old kettle clicked on in the kitchen. Not by habit, but because Koa would rise from the rug at the foot of the bed, stretch out his front legs in that long, sighing bow, and pad gently to the edge of Walter's side. One nudge from that black and tan snout against his hand was enough. No barking, no jumping, just presence. Walter swung his legs off the bed. The scar on his hip ached, but he welcomed it. It reminded him that the day had not been stolen, that he had another chance. Koa followed him to the kitchen, like a shadow that had learned to walk in silence. He didn't say much, but Koa didn't need much. Just the low whistle of the kettle, the clink of dry food in the bowl, and the soft, "Good boy," Walter murmured each time Koa sat without being asked. By 8 a.m., they were out the door. Walter had rehab now 3 days a week at the community center on Maple. The same place that used to feel like a punishment now felt livable, manageable. Because Koa would sit beside the truck until Walter grabbed his cane, then hop into the passenger seat like he'd done it 100 times before. He didn't pant or whine when left outside the gym. He waited. Always waited. Laying by the entrance with his head on his paws, ears twitching at the sound of footsteps but only lifting when Walter returned. The staff had stopped asking questions after the first week. Even the strict young man at the desk, Jordan, or Jared, Walter could never remember, had simply learned to nod at Koa as if he were any other guest, still better behaved than most of the humans, the receptionist had once joked. On the sidewalk out front, an older woman with a cane of her own often passed during Walter's exit. Her name was Mabel, and she wore a pink coat with too many buttons and lipstick that bled at the edges. On the third week, she stopped walking. "That your dog?" Walter nodded. "His name's Koa." She smiled at the name like it was something sacred. Her eyes twinkled. "You know," she said, looking around the block as if checking for ghosts, "this street used to feel tired. Ever since my bill passed. Now, when I see him," she pointed at Koa, "it's like the sun comes back for a few minutes. He's brought light back to this block." Walter didn't know what to say, so he only tipped his cap. That night, he told Koa as they sat on the porch, "You're doing more than you know, boy." Koa turned his head, resting it gently on Walter's knee, eyes blinking slow, as if he understood. The days weren't all easy. Some mornings, Walter's hands trembled so much he couldn't button his flannel. On those days, Koa would stand close, not offering help, just offering warmth, just there. When Walter sat too long in his chair and let the hours pass, Koa would nudge his palm, just enough to say, "It's time to stand again." In the afternoons, they walked a little further, past the oak where Helen used to hang wind chimes, down to the park where children shouted and rode bicycles that seemed too fast, too loud. Koa stayed close to Walter's left leg, mirroring the rhythm of his gait. When Walter slowed, Koa slowed. When Walter paused to take in the sight of the lake, Koa sat beside him, eyes scanning the same horizon. They didn't speak the same language, but they lived it. There was a harmony forming, subtle but undeniable. Koa didn't just adjust to Walter's world, he shaped it, rewrote the silences, filled the house without making a sound. Walter no longer had to talk to himself to feel less alone. He just had to look over, see the slow rise and fall of Koa's chest as he dozed near the fireplace. Neighbors had begun to wave more. Even kidzones Walter never used to notice had started asking, "Can I pet your dog?" He always said yes. And Koa, ever gentle, would sit perfectly still and accept their touch like it was the most important appointment of his day. At night, before bed, Walter would kneel just beside the living room chair and say something into the room. Sometimes it was about Helen. "She would have liked you, you know. She had a soft spot for strays." Sometimes it was about the war. "I still see it, even now, in my sleep. But with you here, it's like it fades a little faster." But most nights, it was simple. "Thank you for staying." And Koa would wag not a wild, tail-thumping frenzy, but that slow, one-sweep wag that said, "I'm still here." 2 lives, once jagged and splintered, now moved to a quiet, shared beat. A new kind of pulse, one not found in charts or measured in prescriptions. Just the sound of paws on wood floor, a chair creaking under old bones, the hush of understanding that doesn't need to be explained. The house was quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that seeped into the floorboards and wrapped around the ribs. Outside, the wind moved the trees with a hush like someone brushing fingers across old pages. Inside, Walter sat on the edge of the porch swing, the wooden slats beneath him groaning softly with each movement. The swing used to carry more weight. Helen's laugh, her knitting, the soft thump of her heel tapping in rhythm. Now, it was just him and Koa. The dog lay sprawled at his feet, his body relaxed but alert, one ear cocked toward the sound of Walter's uneven breath. A slant of sun caught the gray on Walter's beard, turning it silver. He rubbed his temples, then slowly leaned down and rested a trembling hand on Koa's back. "You ever been scared, boy?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Koa didn't answer, of course, but his eyes, those deep, seeing eyes, lifted to meet Walter Cypress. There was no judgment there, no confusion, just presence, and that was enough. Walter exhaled hard through his nose, like he was trying to push something out that had been trapped a long time. They say the worst part of war is coming home. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the ridge of old scars on his left hand. But the truth is, we never really come back. Not all the way. Oh. Koa shifted, moving closer, until his chin came to rest on Walter's knee. The gesture was simple, but it felt like a gate, opening not wide, just a crack, but enough for memory to slip through. I used to write Helen letters from Kandahar, Walter said, his voice distant now. Every night, if I could. She kept every one of them, even the ones that smelled like dust and blood. I thought if I kept writing her, it would keep me tethered. But some nights, he paused, swallowed. Some nights, I didn't know if I wanted to come back. Koa's tail moved just slightly, not wagging, just acknowledgement, like he understood that some truths are too sacred for applause. I never told her about the boy in the market, Walter continued, staring out at the dying light on the sidewalk. He couldn't have been more than 10. They hid the bomb in his satchel. Told him it was candy. When he ran toward us, Walter's voice cracked, and he went quiet for a long moment. I pulled the trigger. He didn't cry. Not then. His eyes had cried too much already, in ways no one saw in the middle of the night when the roof creaked, or when he passed the Afghan market downtown and smelled cumin and gun oil. But his hands shook now, in full view, and Koa saw it all. You don't judge me, Walter murmured. That's why I talk to you. Everyone else has opinions, advice, pity. But you just stay. Ugh. Koa pressed more of his weight against Walter's leg, as if grounding him. His eyes blinked slowly, the way Helen's used to when she was drifting off in the garden, sun on her face, the weight of the world lifted just long enough for peace to enter. I hated myself after Helen passed, Walter admitted. I wasn't there. I was getting my hip done. Routine surgery. She didn't want me to postpone. Said it was just another chemo round. He looked down. I should have known better. She waited until I was under anesthesia to go. This time his voice broke. He didn't fight it. Didn't swallow it down or pretend to be stronger than he was. He let it come. Like the tide, gentle, aching, and full of old salt. Koa, still quiet, still steady, nudged Walter's hand with his snout. It was wet from his own eyes, but the dog didn't pull away. He just stayed. I remember her singing to you, Walter said, wiping his face. You were just a pup, sickly thing. Barely made it through your second month. She'd sit with you by the fireplace and hum those hymns. Sometimes she'd cry into your fur when she thought I was asleep. Koa shifted again, moving in closer now, laying his entire head on Walter's lap. You're the only one who stayed through all of it, Walter whispered, stroking the fur behind Koa's ears. Through the silence, the noise, the empty dinner table, all of it. For a long while, they stayed like that. The sun gave way to twilight, painting the sky in low amber and hush tones. The wind passed gently through the porch screen. A truck rolled by slowly on the gravel road, but neither man nor dog stirred. And then, something changed, not in sound, but in weight. Walter exhaled, deeply this time, and rested his hand fully on Koa's neck. You know, he murmured, maybe we don't get healed all at once. Maybe it's just one soft moment at a time. Koa made a quiet sound. Not kind of bark, not quite a whimper, just a soft, low note from deep in his chest. A sound of agreement, of presence, of knowing. Walter nodded, as if replying to a question no one else heard. I think she sent you, he said, barely audible now. She knew I wouldn't talk to anyone else. In the fading light, the porch no longer looked empty. The swing moved slightly. Just a gentle sway. Walter looked out again toward the garden Helen once tended. Overgrown now, but not forgotten. We'll get through it, boy, he said. Not perfectly, but together. Koa blinked. The porch light flicked on with a click behind them. Neither flinched, neither moved. The night arrived without fanfare, but in it, two wounded souls sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing in sync. Healing wasn't a destination, it was this. Silence shared, pain named, love not lost but waiting patiently, in the shape of a dog's head on an old man's lap. It was late afternoon when Linda's car pulled into the gravel driveway of the farmhouse. The engine rumbled low before it stilled, leaving behind the soft ticking of cooling metal and the distant chirp of sparrows. A breeze stirred the dry leaves piled under the porch step sodom, settling in like a quiet guest. She hesitated before opening the door. In her lap sat a paper bag folded at the top, still warm with cornbread and apple chutney. She'd baked it that morning, something Helen used to do, always with extra for the neighbors. It had taken her weeks to find the courage, even longer to dial Walter's number. But his voice on the other end, gravelly, measured, tired, hadn't resisted. "Come by," he'd said. Just that. Like an old gate creaking open after years of rust. Linda stepped out, heels crunching against gravel. She looked at the house, the same faded white siding, the flower pots long emptied on the windowsills. It was different without Helen's laughter echoing from the porch. The world always lost some color when the people who colored it left. Before she could knock, the door opened. Walter stood in the doorway, leaning slightly on his cane. His eyes were lined deep, but not sharp. Behind him, the warm golden light of late day spilled into the hallway, and beside his leg, like a sentry made of muscle and memory, sat Koa. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, just stared. Steady, calm. Linda took a step back, startled not by fear but by recognition. The last time she'd seen Koa, he was skeletal, unmoving, eyes glazed over in that kennel. A creature folded in on himself like paper scorched at the edges. Now, he was a whole. His coat had a dull sheen under the light, not perfect but healing. His ears twitched at the sound of a distant squirrel, but his body remained still. It was the eyes that stopped her, breath alert, gentle, and something else. Present. Walter caught the shift in her face.
"He remembers you,"
he said, not unkindly.
"but he knows home now."
Linda swallowed. "I brought some bread. And chutney. I figured, come on in." Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and something warm, cooking stew maybe. There were subtle signs of life stitched back into the house. A folded quilt on the couch, mismatched mugs drying by the sink, a worn leash hanging by the door. Koa led the way, padding slowly to the living room. He paused by Helen's old recliner, turned once, and curled up beside it, not on it, as if he still remembered it wasn't his place, but stayed near anyway. Linda followed him with her eyes, something in her chest softening without permission. "He waits for her there," Walter murmured. "Every morning." She turned. "You let him?" "I don't think I had much say in the matter," he said, a ghost of a smile in his voice. She nodded, arms crossed loosely over her chest. "He's changed. So have I." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't brittle. It held room for breath. Linda knelt slowly, setting the paper bag on the coffee table. Koa lifted his head. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what I said that day. About him. About you." Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he lowered himself carefully into the old armchair across from her. "You weren't wrong. Not then. But I was cruel," she whispered. He looked at her, then at the dog who now rested his head on the floor, eyes half closed. "Maybe," he said. "But grief does strange things to people. Makes them say things just to make the ache feel real." Linda blinked fast. "He used to flinch when I got close. Now he looks like he'd follow you into a storm." "He would," Walter said softly. "And maybe I'd follow him too." The words landed between them like stones in a quiet pond rippling outward, soft but heavy. She looked down. Her fingers brushed Koa's paw gently, hesitantly. He didn't move away. "He was always Helen's," she said. Walter nodded. "Still is, I think, but maybe now he's mine, too." For a long moment, the room was only ticking clocks and quiet breathing. No sermons, no confessions, just time, holding them gently in its hands. Linda stood at last. Would you let me visit sometimes?" Walter raised an eyebrow, but there was warmth behind it. "It's his house, too. If he agrees, I don't see why not." Koa raised his head, wagged his tail once. Just once. Linda blinked back, a sudden sting behind her eyes. "Well," she exhaled, a little laugh escaping. "That settles it then." As she walked back to her car, she glanced over her shoulder. Through the window, she could see Walter sitting in his chair, Koa beside him. the late sun painting them both in hues of gold and memory. Something cracked in her chest, a fault line of guilt beginning to shift. Not broken, but opened. Enough for light to get in. And that, sometimes, was where healing began. The mornings had grown slower in the house on Maple Hill Lane. Walter lingered longer at the kitchen table, tea cooling in his hands. The light through the curtains was the same, but something felt off, like a clock ticking just a bit too loud. At 81, what didn't take a little more effort? He chalked it up to age, but Koa knew better. The German Shepherd no longer stayed by the fireplace, now slept beside Walter's bed, alert to every cough, every breath. When Walter nearly stumbled retrieving the paper one morning, Koa stood rigid at the door, nudging his thigh, insistent, the same way he had with Helen back when her heart began to fail. Walter looked down. "You sense it, don't you?" he whispered. Koa didn't blink. His silence said everything. That day, they skipped the walk. Instead, Walter reclined, Koa beside him. He looked up at Helen's photo. "You knew before I did," he told the dog. "Back when she started forgetting names. You waited outside her door before we even had a diagnosis." It wasn't a flashy life, just quiet loyalty. A bond forged through grief and time. Two broken souls, smoothed by living. That evening, Walter rubbed his chest again. Dismissed it. Acid reflux, maybe. He didn't mention it to Linda when she called. Didn't want to worry her. But Koa noticed. Again, he licked Walter's hand urgently, not affectionately, pleading. Walter was startled not by the act, but by what it meant. "You feel it, don't you?" Walter whispered. "Something shifting." That night, Koa stayed at the foot of the bed, ears twitching with every uneven breath, a sentinel in silence. And at dawn, Walter stirred, voice a thin rasp. "Thanks for staying." Koa leaned in, pressed gently into Walter's chest, waiting, listening. Still, later that morning, Walter tried to go upstairs. "Just for a sweater," he said. But his breath was shallow. His hand trembled on the railing. Then came the soft thud, Koa stepping between him and the stairs. Still, immovable. "Let me by, boy," Walter said softly. But Koa didn't move. Walter sighed, not annoyed, but knowing. The same sigh he used to give Helen when she handed him tea after a coughing fit. "I know you see what I don't want to admit." He stepped back, and Koa finally laid down, his tail sweeping the rug once, gently. A few hours later, Dr. Alvarez arrived. She came every third Thursday. A friend, more than a doctor. Helen's friend, too. "I brought your ginger candies," she smiled, then paused. "You look pale, Walt." "Just tired." He smiled weakly. Koa's making a fuss over nothing. Koa stood between them. When her hand neared Walter's chest, growled. It wasn't anger. It was a message. "Something is wrong, and I won't let you ignore it." Alvarez froze, then nodded. She understood. That night, Walter sat at the kitchen table in his patched flannel, pen hovering above a notepad. Koa rested at his feet, his warm body grounding Walter to the world. It had been 3 days since the diagnosis. Congestive heart failure, the doctor had said. Weeks, maybe a few months. Walter hadn't cried, just asked where to pay. But now, in the quiet, he began writing. Koa likes warm water in his food. Sleeps by the window at 2 p.m. sharp. Don't block that spot. He watches the mail truck like it's a mission. He's scared of thunder. Just hum. Helen used to hum. He remembers. He paused, reached for cold coffee. Koa shifted, sighing softly. The list continued. He nudges you for walks, never early, never late, just when you need it. He loves kids. And Mrs. Klein, she sneaks him turkey slices. He mourns in silence. If he stares out the window for hours, don't worry. Just sit with him. That's enough. Walter leaned back, eyes closed. This is the hardest part, he muttered, letting go of the one who stayed. He pulled the old camcorder off the shelf, dusted it off, propped it up, and sat in his chair. Koa watched curiously. Walter pressed record. If you're watching this, he began. I'm probably not here to say it in person. He looked down at Koa. This boy saved my life, not by pulling me from wreckage, just by staying. When Helen died and I was hollow, he stayed. His throat, caught. I know he'll grieve. You might not see it, but you'll feel it. Don't rush him. He turned to the lens. Linda, if you're the one taking him, it's not a chore. It's a gift. He doesn't replace anyone, but he fills the quiet with something honest. Walter's eyes grew glassy. Sometimes he sighs at night. It means he's remembering. Sit beside him. Tell him Helen says hello. Tell him the garden bloomed again. He clicked off the camera. Later that evening, he placed the video on a USB labeled, "For Linda, for Koa." He slipped the list into a yellow envelope. On the back, he wrote, "He was never just a dog. He was the part of me that remembered how to live." A knock. Then silence. Koa didn't move from his post by the door. Linda stepped in. She hadn't visited in weeks, Stu. Many feelings she hadn't named. Shame, grief, love. She spotted the photos on the mantel. Walter in uniform. Helen laughing. Koa on the beach, mid-wag. Then she saw him. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling. Koa stared, unmoving. Then, slowly, he walked to her, rested his head on her shoulder. Not pushing, just resting. Linda cried, "I'm so sorry. For everything." He didn't move, just let her hold him. Later, they entered the bedroom together. Walter lay propped up on pillows. "Well," he rasped, "guess I'm not hallucinating." "I came back," Linda said. Walter smiled faintly. His hand found Koa's head. "He missed you." "So did I." "Did you watch the video?" "I did." "Will you take him?" She looked down at Koa. "I will. Not because I have to. Because I want to." Koa let out a soft breath, a release, as if something had been waiting for this. Walter smiled. "Thank you." "No," Linda said, taking his hand. "Thank you." That afternoon, golden light wrapped the garden. Walter sat beneath the pergola, Koa beside him. Before them, Helen's roses bloomed yellow ones in the back. "I told her I'd keep them alive," Walter whispered. "I think I lied." He placed a hand on Koa's neck. "You always knew before I did. When Helen was sick, when I was slipping." He reached into his blanket, pulled out a folded note. "Tell her I did okay," he said. "Tell her I loved her the best I could." Koa climbed onto the bench, rested his head on Walter's chest. The old man leaned slightly to the side, welcoming the weight. "Linda's got you now," Walter murmured. "You changed her, Koa. Not me. You." He stroked the dog's fur. "Promise me one thing. Don't stop listening. Someone someday will need what you gave me." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of late summer roses. Walter opened his eyes one last time. "I wasn't ready for you," he said. "Maybe nobody ever is, for the thing that saves them." His chest rose, fell, then no more. Koa didn't move, just stayed there. Guardian turned witness. A petal drifted to the ground, and for a long time, the garden was silent. Then Koa exhaled. Not grief, but memory. "Okay," she whispered to Koa. "Okay, boy." She backed up slowly and went to her bag. "Walter," she said after a moment, her voice laced with the kind of concern doctors usually hide. "I need to listen to your chest, but more than that, I want to take your vitals. Something's off. I told you, just tired." No," she said gently but firmly. "You've been tired for weeks. Koa knows it too." Walter chuckled weakly, then stopped short when the motion tugged at something inside him. A sharp pinch just behind the ribs. Alvarez noticed. Her hands were calm, practiced. She slipped the stethoscope under his shirt, and this time, Koa didn't growl. He just stared, eyes locked on her hands. She listened, long enough for Walter to feel the silence pressing in. "Your heart rhythm's irregular," she finally said. "And there's a murmur. I need you to come in for an EKG, soon." He looked away, toward the recliner Helen used to sit in. A quilt she'd sewn still lay folded on its arm, untouched. Walter's voice was almost a whisper. "You think it's serious. I think it's not something we should ignore, and neither does Koa." At that, the old man looked down. Koa had rested his chin on Walter's knee now. The growl was gone, replaced with a deep stillness of concern. A look that didn't need language. It was the same gaze he'd given Helen when she had her chemo blanket pulled tight, when her hands trembled on cold mornings, and her strength slipped silently between the cushions of the recliner. Walter reached down, fingers sliding through Koa's fur. I used to think I was the one watching over him. You still are, Alvarez said. But he's watching over you now, too. The words stayed in the air long after she left. That evening, the sky outside the window turned a dusky orange. Not dramatic, just the slow surrender of light. Walter sat at the kitchen table, not touching the soup she'd made him. Koa lay beside his feet, tail brushing against the linoleum in rhythm with Walter's breath. He spoke aloud, voice quiet, scratchy. You knew before I did, didn't you? Koa didn't move. You knew something in me was off. Before the stethoscope. Before even Alvarez. The dog lifted his head slightly. Walter smiled, bitter and soft. Helen used to say dogs can hear what our hearts won't say out loud. He leaned down, resting a shaky hand on Koa's back. I guess some things don't die with the person. They live on, in whatever's left behind. Outside, the wind rustled the maple leaves. Inside, the air held the warmth of shared silence. And at the foot of the man whose breath had started to falter, the German shepherd who once lay waiting for a woman who would never return now waited for something else. Not for death, but for the choice to live with what comes next. The hospital hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon floor polish, like someone had tried to clean away time. Walter sat in the exam room, the white paper crinkling under him with every breath. Koa lay curled at his feet, one ear tilted back, always listening. Dr. Alvarez entered quietly, holding a slim folder against her chest. Her expression was gentler than usual, more deliberate. She didn't speak right away, only nodded at Walter and crouched to run her hand down Koa's back. The German shepherd didn't move, didn't wag. His eyes stayed on Walter's chest, like he already knew. The silence tightened, dense like fog. Then, we got the echocardiogram results back. Is it? Walter didn't answer, just folded his fingers together in his lap, knuckles knobby and pale. Walter, your heart's failing. The room shifted, not violently, not with a crash, but like something had been quietly removed, a supporting beam you didn't realize held everything up. Dr. Alvarez sat across from him, her voice a low, careful whisper. There's a significant loss of function in the left ventricle. It's progressed faster than we hoped. If you push it exertion, stress, anything, there's risk of a full collapse. He blinked slowly, as if trying to decide whether to believe her. How long? He asked, though the air already felt shorter. A few months. Maybe less. The word didn't land on him the way it might have 10 years ago. He didn't flinch or swear or bargain. Instead, his breath came out slow and soft. Then he looked down at Koa, the dog's nose pressed against his boot now, eyes dark and unwavering. Walter cleared his throat. What about my dog? Dr. Alvarez paused. What about him? Walter shook his head faintly, like her question had misunderstood something sacred. Who will be with him? His voice cracked not from fear of death, but from the unfinished business of love. Dr. Alvarez swallowed. Her eyes darted to Koa, then back. I've seen dogs grieve. They know. They feel it. But if we plan, we can find someone. Someone who'll honor the bond you have. We have time. But Walter's hands began to tremble, and he pressed them between his knees. Number not someone. Someone isn't enough. Koa sat up slowly, resting his head against Walter's thigh. His breath was steady, warm through the denim, as if saying, I'm here. I know. There was a long pause. No one moved. Dr. Alvarez finally asked, Do you want to be admitted? We can stabilize you, keep you monitored. He looked out the small window, where wind toyed with a branch. There was nothing in the view but sky. No, he said. I want to go home. That night, the silence in the house had shape. It wasn't emptiness, it was presence. Walter moved slowly, his steps more deliberate than before, like every heartbeat had a weight now. Koa trailed beside him, silent, attentive, never more than a few feet away. He left the lights off, letting the house glow in the soft silver of the porch light outside. The photo of Helen still sat on the mantel, her hands in the garden soil, Koa licking her wrist like a thank you. Walter touched the frame. I don't think I'm afraid, he said aloud. Koa tilted his head. I've seen death before, too many times to count, but this one's slower, more personal. He sat carefully into his chair, the one by the window. Koa curled up beside him without needing to be told. The old man reached down, his fingers tangling in fur. "You remember Afghanistan?" he asked gently. "That night in the ravine? I thought we were done. You didn't leave then either." Koa's tail gave a single thump. Walter swallowed hard. "I've buried soldiers. I've buried Helen, but I don't want to be the last one you bury." The dog shifted, pushing closer. "And you already know, don't you? You knew before Alvarez said it." Koa licked his hand, then pressed his forehead to Walter's knee. "I'm sorry," Walter whispered. "You've done enough, more than enough." But Koa didn't move, didn't flinch. He just breathed with him. Later that night, Linda called. Her voice came through the line unsure, like someone trying to speak across water. "Dad?" "Yeah. Dr. Alvarez," she told me. Silence. "I didn't want to believe it," she said. "But I saw the numbers. She wasn't guessing." Walter nodded, though she couldn't see it.
You okay?
She asked.
But I'm at peace.
She sniffled. "Do you want me to come stay with you?" He glanced at Koa, curled like a question mark at his feet. "No," he said gently. "But I want you to come see Koa. Learn him. Understand him. He's going to need someone who doesn't just feed him, but sees him." There was a pause, then a quiet. "I'll come this weekend." Walter closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." At midnight, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Walter stirred, but didn't rise. His heart beat like a tired drum, now steady, but soft. Koa rose, placed his chin on the side of the bed. Walter opened his eyes. They didn't need to speak. The dog climbed up slowly, laying beside him the way Helen once had. Not touching, just near, enough for warmth to pass from one soul to another. Walter's hand found Koa's ruff. The room was still. "I'm not afraid," he said again, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Just, I hope I gave you a good life too." Koa gave a low, rumbling sigh, a sound that meant, "You did." They stayed that way, breathing in unison. Two hearts, one slowly fading, the other refusing to leave. The morning was still not silent, but still in the way a house knows something is changing. Walter sat at the kitchen table in his old patched flannel shirt. Koa, his German shepherd, rested at his feet, anchoring him to the moment. It had been 3 days since the diagnosis. Congestive heart failure. Weeks, maybe a few months left. Walter hadn't cried, just nodded and asked where to pay. But now, in the quiet, it all pressed in. He picked up his pen and started a list not for himself, but for whoever would care for Koa after. Koa likes warm water in his food. He naps at 2 p.m. sharp by the window. Don't block the light. He fears thunder. Just hum. Helen used to hum too. Each line was a memory disguised as a note. A way of preparing Koa for a world without him. Walter paused. "This is the hardest part," he whispered. "Letting go of the one who stayed." He took out the old camcorder untouched, since Helen passed and set it up. Koa sat beside him as Walter pressed record. "If you're watching this," he began, "I'm probably gone. But this boy, he saved me. Not by doing anything heroic, just by staying." Walter's voice cracked. After Helen died, Koa stayed. He never rushed me. Never asked for more than presence. And that kind of love, it's holy. Ugh. He addressed Linda next. "I know we weren't close, but if you're the one taking him, know this. He isn't a chore. He's a gift." He looked at Koa again, hand resting on his fur. "He sighs like an old man sometimes. That means he remembers. So sit with him. Tell him Helen's garden bloomed again." Walter ended the video with a smile, sealed it on a USB, and labeled it simply, "For Linda, for Koa." On the envelope, he wrote a final line. He was never just a dog. He was the part of me that remembered how to live. The house was quiet that afternoon. Koa waited by the hallway, still alert, his eyes fixed on the closed door behind which Walter rested. A knock came. Koa barely lifted his head. There had been many knocks, nurses, neighbors, but this one was different. Linda stepped in. It had been weeks. She wasn't sure what brought her back. Guilt, love, something unspoken. Her eyes scanned the room. Photos of Helen, of Walter, and of Kotung out, mid-run on the beach. She spotted him. He didn't bark, didn't move, just watched her with eyes that held stories. She knelt, patting her lap.
Hey, sweetheart.
At first, Koa didn't move. Then, slowly, he patted over and rested his head gently on her shoulder. No push, no nuzzle. Just trust. Linda wept.
I'm sorry,
She whispered into his fur. For everything. She didn't know how long they stayed like that. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't let herself feel in years, love. Quiet. Steady. I thought I couldn't do it, she said. Love again. Not like this. But I was wrong. A cough echoed down the hall. Walter. She and Koa walked together into his room. He was thinner, but his eyes still had fight. Well, he rasped, smiling. Guess I'm not hallucinating. I came back, Linda said. Walter nodded, hand-finding Koa's head. He missed you. So did I. Did you watch the video? She nodded. I did. Will you take him? Linda looked at Koa. He sat quietly, tail curled, eyes on her. I will, she said. Not because I have to, because I want to. Koa let out a soft breath, a release, as if he'd been waiting for that moment. Walter smiled faintly. Thank you. No, Linda replied, taking his hand. Thank you. That evening, the sky glowed gold as Walter and Koa sat together on the garden bench. The rose garden Helen's pride bloomed with soft, defiant color. Yellow ones in the back, her favorite. Told her I'd keep them alive, Walter murmured. Told her they'd never miss her more than I would. I think I lied. Koa sat upright beside him, ears twitching not from sound, but memory. Walter touched his neck gently. You always knew when I was drifting. How do you do that? Koa blinked slowly. Leaned in. Walter chuckled soft, frayed. When Helen passed, I stopped listening. You didn't bark. You just waited. From his lap, he pulled a creased note. Tell her I did okay, he whispered. Tell her I loved her as best I could. Koa moved carefully, climbing onto the bench and laying his head on Walter's chest. The old man tilted to meet him. This spot, Walter said. She'd read here, sometimes sing. I'd pretend to sleep so she wouldn't stop. Walter smiled. Linda's got you now. You changed her, Koa. Not me. You. He gripped the dog's fur lightly. Promise me one thing, don't stop listening. Even when life gets loud again. Someone will need what you gave me. The breeze carried the scent of late summer roses. Walter looked at Koa, eyes soft. I wasn't ready for you. Maybe nobody ever is for the thing that saves them. His chest rose, fell, then didn't rise again. Koa didn't move, didn't whimper, just rested there. Guardian turned witness. A yellow petal fell near Walter's shoe, and for a long time, the garden said nothing. Then Koa exhaled. Not grief, but memory. A choice to remain. He stayed there until the sun slipped behind the trees. The dawn crept in softly that morning, brushing the blinds with golden light. Outside, dew clung to the roses in Helen's garden, their petals heavy with the hush of early autumn. Even the birds held back, as if the day itself sensed something sacred. Inside, everything was still. A kitchen light hummed above an untouched cup of chamomile tea. In the corner, Walter's old armchair sat bathed in morning shadow, empty, but not abandoned. In the bedroom, the only sound was breath. Slow, shallow, then slower still. Walter Callahan lay on his back, chest barely rising beneath the knit blanket Helen once made. His lips parted gently, one hand resting over his heart. The other brushed against fur, soft, warm, steady. Koa was there, as always. The German shepherd lay curled at Walter's side, nose tucked against his ribs. All night, he hadn't moved. No bark, no whine, just presence, like he was holding the last thread of life with his body. When the final breath came just before sunrise, it wasn't a gasp, it was an exhale. Peaceful, like the end of a sentence you didn't know you were writing. And then, silence. Not even a bark. Later, the neighbors would say, the morning felt different. The air heavier, the birds quieter. From Walter's home, usually warmed by the low rumble of Koa's voice, there was nothing. Just stillness. Linda, sensing something she couldn't explain, let herself in with the spare key. Her voice echoed gently. "Walter?" No answer. She found him in the bedroom face, serene, creases softened, and beside him, Koa. Still, head resting near Walter's chest, eyes open but dimmed, listening to a heartbeat that was no longer there. She didn't cry at first, just knelt beside the bed, pressing trembling fingers to Walter's. "You didn't wait for goodbye, did you?" Koa finally moved. He lifted his head, slow and heavy, and looked at her. And in that gaze, Linda saw something deeper than sorrow acceptance, understanding. As if Koa had already grieved, and now simply needed her to catch up. She opened her arms. He came without hesitation, head pressed into her chest, silent, weighty, smelling faintly of pine and Walter's aftershave. There would be time for arrangements, for calls and papers and soft-voiced condolences, but not yet. This moment belonged to them. She stayed until the light shifted, brushing Walter's hair with gold. Outside, a sparrow finally sang. One note, then another, a hesitant return to the world. Before she left, Linda found a note on the dresser. Walter's handwriting, worn and shaky. For Linda. For Koa. "If you're reading this, I've gone to find Helen. I hope she's wearing her green dress. Koa remembers. Take care of him not because he needs it, but because I think he'll take care of you, too. He listens when your heart forgets how to speak." She pressed the letter to her chest. "I'll take him home," she whispered. And Koa, as if he'd heard Walter himself, leaned into her again and exhaled. The funeral was simple. A small chapel. Wooden pews. No fanfare. Just how Walter would have liked it. Veterans lined the front row, uniforms crisp. Neighbors filled the back, the ones who'd waved at Walter on his morning walks. Linda sat near the front. And beside Herr Koa, no harness, just a black collar and Walter's old leather leash. Around his neck hung a small, smooth piece of metal, Walter's military commendation. Linda had pinned it there herself, not as decoration, as a symbol. Koa didn't move much, just saddle, silent, searching, as though he expected to hear that familiar whistle, that cough, that voice. But it never came. The flag sat folded at the altar, no casket. Walter had asked for a chesto be scattered in the garden where Helen's roses still bloomed. The chaplain spoke softly. "Sometimes we learn about a man not from his words, but from the loyalty of his dog." A hush followed. Koa blinked slowly, as if he understood. Linda stood, drawing a folded letter from her coat pocket. On the back, "For the one who stays." Inside, only one line. "He held me together, even when I forgot who I was." She didn't read it aloud, just knelt right there, on the cold wooden, looked Koa in the eyes. "This world doesn't deserve dogs like you," she whispered. "But I promise I'll try to be enough." Koa leaned in, forehead against hers. Not obedience, not habit, just grief and trust. After the service, Linda walked with him down the gravel path, past the trees now stirring gently in the wind. At the garden gate, she paused. "You ready?" she asked. He didn't answer. He stepped forward, past the gate, into the world that remained. Linda followed, the leash slack between them, not as restraint, as memory. Together they walked through the yard past the roses, where Walter would return to earth. Above them, the wind lifted, brushing the petals, rustling the leaves, soft, almost like breath, almost like a promise kept. The house was noisier than Koa was used to. Laughter echoed down the hallway. Small feet pattered across the hardwood floor like hurried raindrops, and the kitchen always smelled like cinnamon toast and jelly-sticky fingers. It was nothing like Walter's Placino grandfather clock ticking solemn hours, no slippers placed just so near the hearth, but the warmth was familiar, just different in shape. On the first morning, Koa wandered room to room, as if mapping a new territory not just by scent, but by memory. His nails clicked quietly against the floor as he passed a bookshelf packed with picture books and Lego sculptures. A pair of sneakers lay forgotten by the stairs. From the window, sunlight spilled onto a patch of backyard lawn where two kids chased each other barefoot. Linda's voice called softly from the kitchen. Breakfast ready in 5, boys. Koa paused at the threshold of the living room, ears rotating. His tail didn't wag, not yet, but it didn't tuck, either. He was learning, adjusting. The older boy, Henry years old, and already full of the kind of empathy that doesn't require explanation, was the first to sit beside him without asking anything. No command, no reach, no treats. Just presence. He sat cross-legged, placed a hand on the carpet, and let Koa decide. After a moment, the dog lay beside him. Their breathing synced quiet, careful, new. "Mom says you were Grandpa Walter's best friend," Henry whispered. "I think you're gonna like it here." Koa didn't move, but he blinked slowly. The way Walter had once taught him was okay. Trust didn't come in a rush. It arrived in pieces, quiet mornings, steady routines, voices that stayed gentle even when days were loud. By the end of the first week, Koa had found his corners. The soft rug by the fireplace, the back deck at sunset, the shady patch under the magnolia tree. And every night, he slept under a quilt that once belonged to Helena, rose-colored, thread-worn piece Linda had kept tucked away all these years, folded in cedar. When she laid it across Koa's bed that first night, she whispered, "She'd want you to have this. She always did love old souls." And Koa, he curled into it, like memory. Not with a wag, not with a whine, just a sigh. Like his chest had finally remembered how to rest. The younger boy, Leo, had a voice that never stayed at one volume. He shouted when he was happy, shouted when he was sad, and only whispered when he thought it was a secret. But even Leoho at 5 had never been asked to earn a dog's trust, learned quickly that Koa wasn't a toy. He was a keeper of something sacred. One afternoon, Linda found Leo crouched beside Koa in the laundry room. The boy had a crayon and was drawing something on a notepad with comical focus. On the page was a picture of a big dog beside a man with a cane and stars on his shirt. "This is you and Grandpa," Leo said, holding it up for Koa. "But now you're with us. We're your new pack." And Koa, as if he understood, maybe he did let his head drop into the boy's lap. At the dinner table one night, Henry asked Linda, "Was Koa there when he passed away?" Linda nodded, the motion small, like the answer was tucked between memories too fragile to lift. "He was right beside him, like always." The room quieted. Even Leo stopped chewing his mac and cheese. "Does he miss him?" Henry asked. Linda looked toward the rug where Koa lay, eyes half-lidded, ears still alert. "I think he carries him. That's different than missing." Henry nodded like he understood. And maybe he did. Grief makes old souls out of young ones, too. The neighbors came by sometimes, bringing warm casseroles and soft condolences. Many knew Walter from his Navy days or his years volunteering at the local shelter. They'd all heard about Koeth, loyal shepherd who walked beside a man until his last breath. One neighbor, an elderly woman with silver curls and kind eyes, knelt down and stroked Koa's head. "You've still got work to do, don't you?" she whispered. And Koa, ever so slightly, thumped his tail once against the floor. Linda bought him a new collar. Sturdy leather, deep mahogany, with a silver nameplate. Koa, loved, always. She fastened Walter's old military pin to it just beneath the name, where it caught the light like a small star. The pin had lost some shine, but not its meaning. "Carrying the flame," she said softly as she clipped it around his neck. Just like he did. Koa sat tall, ears forward. The next day, Henry introduced him to his friends as our wise one. The name stuck. And so the days settled. Koa learned when school ended by the sound of the bus brakes and waited by the window 5 minutes early, tail sweeping the floor when the boys appeared. He trotted beside Linda during her morning walks, now slower and shorter, but no less sacred. And at night, before bed, the family would gather in the living room. Henry with a book, Leo with his blanket, Linda with a steaming mug of tea. Sometimes they'd play a recording of Walter's old voice one he left on Linda's phone, telling a story, reading a poem, talking to Koa. And Koa would sit near the speaker, head tilted, ears twitching, not confused, not startled, just listening. Like he always did, like he always would. The house had a rhythm now. Not hurried, not loud, just a soft hum of life unfolding. Shoes by the door, crayon drawings on the fridge, the quiet creak of stairs in the evening. And in the center of it all, Koa, always watching, always knowing when to step forward or when to simply be still. It was a Thursday night, the kind with a hint of summer lingering in the breeze, warm enough to leave the windows cracked open. Linda sat cross-legged on the floor beside the children's bunk beds, her voice a calm tide washing through the dim room. The kids Emily and Jack were already tucked in, hair damp from baths, limbs heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from laughter and dirt under fingernails. Koa lay near the foot of the bed, not quite asleep, not quite alert. His ears twitched every now and then, like he was sorting through memories even as he dozed. "Tell us again," Emily whispered, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "The story about the rose garden." Linda smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "Again?" Both children nodded in unison. She paused, the kind of pause that isn't for effect, but for reverence. Her fingers laced together, and when she spoke, it was not with performance, but with a kind of gratitude. "It was your great-grandmother Helen's favorite place," she began. "She used to say the roses told stories. If you sat long enough, quietly enough, you could hear them whisper. Each bloom was like a little memory." Koa's ears perked up. "Not much, just a fraction." But Linda noticed. She always did. She planted them when she was still strong enough to kneel in the dirt. Red ones for strength, pink for kindness, white for the people she missed. There was one yellow rose way in the back. That one she called her Wild Hope. Jack giggled softly. "That's a weird name for a flower." Linda's gaze lingered on him, her voice growing gentler. It was her way of saying some things bloom when you least expect them to. Koa shifted, his nose brushing the floor. His body didn't move much, but his tail gave a subtle thump. "Once, she met your great-grandfather Walter in that garden," Linda continued. "He was younger then, still wearing his uniform, still carrying the war on his shoulders. Helen said he looked lost at first, like he hadn't quite come all the way home." Emily asked quietly. "But he did come home, right?" Linda nodded. "He did. Not all at once, not easily. But he came home to her. She was his peace." The words sat there, soft and full, like the scent of old wood and rosewater. Linda took a breath, her fingers grazing the edge of the storybook that now sat untouched on her lap. Years later, after Helen passed, Walter was alone, or he would have been if it weren't for someone special. The children leaned in closer. She looked at Koa then, really looked. "This boy right here, he wasn't just a dog. He was family. He was the last piece of Walter's heart that still beat." Koa didn't stir, but his breathing grew deeper, slower, like the words folded into him, each syllable familiar in the marrow. "I remember the day I came back to visit Walter," Linda said, her voice softening to a whisper. "He was frail, but he wasn't afraid, because Koa was there, always at his side, always knowing what he needed before he said a word." Emily blinked slowly, her hand reaching out to rest near Koa's paw. "He used to sit with Walter by the rose garden," Linda added, "in the exact spot Helen loved most. And one day, Walter whispered to him, 'Tell her I did okay.'" The room held its breath. Jack looked toward Koa, who remained still, but somehow present-like. He was not just listening, but remembering. "And did he?" Jack asked. Linda smiled, and something old and beautiful flickered in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, he did more than okay." Outside, the wind moved through the trees in the backyard, the same trees that once stood near Helen's roses. Some of the flowers still bloomed in spring, even now, wild, resilient. "You know," Linda said, reaching forward to smooth Emily's blanket, "your great-grandfather left behind something more than medals and stories. He left this boy, and now he's here, part of our pack, just like they would have wanted." Emily turned to Koa, her voice barely more than a breath. "He remembers them, doesn't he?" Linda nodded. "In his way. Dogs never forget the ones they love. Not in the heart. Not ever." Koa opened one eye just slightly, if to confirm it. His tail twitched again, a tiny echo of something warm. "I think he likes when we talk about them," Emily said. Jack yawned. "Then we should do it every night." The room dimmed further as clouds drifted across the moon, drawing a soft pattern of shadows across the walls. Linda stood slowly, pulling the blanket up over Jack's shoulder. She bent and kissed his forehead, then Emily's, her hands lingering just a little longer. Before switching off the lamp, she glanced back at Koa. He was watching her. That look, again the one Walter used to mention. The quiet recognition. The kind of gaze that holds not just presence, but lineage. A bridge between what was and what still is. Linda walked over, crouched beside him, and whispered, "Thank you for remembering with us." Koa lowered his head, resting it on his paws, eyes still on her. In that stillness was a promise, not of guarding, not of service, but of witness, that he would carry the stories and that he would let the children carry them too. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the room hummed with breath and memory. And at the foot of the bed, under the soft pool of moonlight, the wise one kept watch silent, faithful, whole. The sign at the shelter hadn't changed faded green letters on a wooden board that once stood straighter, newer. It creaked as the wind nudged it. Second Home Animal Refuge. It still read. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the sun broke through the clouds just long enough to soften the path leading to the front door. Or maybe it was the quiet, careful steps of an old German shepherd who had once waited far too long on the other side of that gate. Linda stepped out first, holding the leash, not out of necessity, but ceremony. Koa walked beside her without tension, his pace slow but steady, like he knew this was more than a visit, it was a return. A full circle. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with lavender and antiseptic, clean but kind. The reception area hadn't changed much. A corkboard still held faded adoption photos and thank you notes scrawled by shaky hands. One caught Linda's eye, a photo of Walter and Koa from years ago, taken by a volunteer during one of their early training visits. Walter had written beneath it in blocky, stubborn handwriting, "He's not just a dog, he's a keeper of time. Oh." Linda pressed her fingers to her lips, breathing through the sudden knot in her throat. Koa paused by the chair. He once waited beside the same corner where hope and grief used to sit side by side in his chest like unwelcome guests. For a long time, that chair had been his compass. He'd watched every face that entered this building, searching. Not anymore. Today, he walked past it. In the back room, the senior program was already underway. A few elderly residents from the nearby assisted living home sat in a gentle semicircle, each cradling a blanket or stroking a lapdog. A volunteer was softly reading from a large print book about animals and memory. The words barely reached the ears, but the warmth in the room did. Linda unlatched the leash, but said nothing. Koa didn't need direction. He moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned the language of silence. The first to notice him was Mr. Penrose, a retired school teacher whose hands trembled when he reached out. "Well, hello there, soldier," he whispered. Koa stepped close and gently leaned his head into the man's chest. No bark, no trick, just presence. The man's shoulders sagged with relief, as if he'd been holding something heavy no one else could see. A few feet away, Mrs. Klein watched with misted eyes. "He reminds me of my Toby," she murmured, not to anyone in particular. Except Toby was never that gentle. This one, he looks like he's been somewhere and come back kinder. Linda sat on a nearby bench, letting the moment stretch. She didn't call Koa, didn't intervene. This was his moment, his choice. He moved from person to person like a quiet current, knowing somehow who needed a nudge and who needed stillness. With one woman, he simply lay at her feet. She hadn't spoken in weeks, the volunteers had said. But her fingers, thin and veined, reached down and found his ear. She didn't speak now either, but her eyes softened. And for the first time in a long while, someone saw her. In the corner of the room, a man in a wheelchair watched without approaching. He had a military cap on his lap and scars that no one mentioned. Koa noticed him, last but not least. He walked over, paused, and sat. The man looked down. "You serve too, huh?" Koa blinked slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He rested his paw on the man's foot. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't cute. It was reverent. The man didn't cry, but his hand clenched around the cap like it held an old secret. "Semper Fi," he whispered. Across the room, a young staffer captured the moment with her phone, then tucked it away like something sacred. Later, in the quiet of the volunteer lounge, Linda filled out the monthly schedule. Koa lay curled beneath the desk, his breath even, his eyes half closed but alert, the kind of alert that doesn't startle, doesn't judge, just watches, quietly holding the space. A blanket lay folded in the corner. It was the one Helen had sewn, long ago, when Linda was still a teenager, and Walter still went to church on Sundays. It had small embroidered names along the hem: Walt, Helen, Linda, and now, Koa. One of the other volunteers asked, "How long has he been doing this?" Linda looked up, then smiled, not the kind that stretches across the face, but the kind that starts behind the eyes. "Longer than you'd think," she said, "even before he knew it." Later that afternoon, as the last residents were wheeled back to their shuttle, Koa remained by the door, his tail tapping gently. A woman turned back and touched her chest. "That dog," he remembers. And he did. He remembered the long wait, the empty hours, the faces that didn't stay. But we remembered something else too. The feel of children's laughter bouncing down a hallway. The softness of Helen's blanket in a new house that smelled of waffles and crayon wax. The trust in Linda's voice when she told bedtime stories about people who loved deeply and dogs who stayed. He still carried Walter's pin on his collar, nestled in the worn leather. A soldier's symbol, a grandfather's legacy. But more than faith carried the warmth. And in the quiet of the old shelter, where so many beginnings and endings had brushed past each other, Koa became something he'd never been allowed to be before. A bridge, not just between people and dogs, but between what was and what still could be. And somewhere, behind those watchful amber eyes, he was still sitting by that old chair. Only now, when someone reached out, stood up, and shared the warmth. Some bonds don't need words. They're felt in quiet mornings, shared glances, and the way a dog rests his head in your lap without asking for anything but presence. Walter and Koa's story reminds us that loyalty doesn't fade with time, and love often comes on four legs, bearing silent wisdom and unwavering devotion. German shepherds like Koa don't just serve, they remember. They carry the echoes of every kindness, every promise kept. In return, they give us more than we often deserve: courage, comfort, and company through our hardest days. If this story stirred something in you, maybe it's time to deepen your own connection. There's a gentle little resource I came across that helps people understand their dogs better, their pasts, their needs, even their silences. It's not fancy, just thoughtful. If you're curious, I'd be happy to share it. No pressure, just something from one dog lover to another. Because sometimes, the best conversations in life don't need words, just trust, time, and a hand resting quietly on a faithful shoulder.